Cool.
Welcome to For F1's Sake, a podcast by two idiotic Formula One fans chatting absolute nonsense and offering our ridiculously biased opinions. And obviously we are now end of season, and we thought we'd do a lengthy 2022 post-season review. So I kind of put it to you guys, what you thought of this season as a whole in comparison to at least last season, which was the most controversial season, I think, maybe ever.
You're going first on this one. I'm going to see what you say first.
Well, we've said it so many times before. Me and Tom were both there when the last race happened, with Max and Lewis being even on points, which is probably the first time we've seen that happen. And when was the last time we saw that? Two.
Well, it goes back quite a while. There was obviously some very dominant years where championships were literally 1, 3, 4, 5 races before the end of the season. So you've probably got to go quite a way back.
Yeah, because even this year we got really close on points between the drivers below Max. Obviously, Max has won 15 races or something this season. So, but yeah, last year was just a bit of a shit show, and with the cost cap things happening right towards the end of the season, where we started hearing about certain things happening, and this year it's really come to fruition. Mm-hmm. Makes this year a bit more controversial, in my opinion. So, I don't know. My opinion is not really very informed compared to what yours would be, because you've been there.
I think for me this year, we've had that anticipation of those new car regs, which was obviously delayed because of COVID. So that was always a talking point of, are we actually going to see what we've heard so much about, cars racing closer together? And I think we did. I think the racing this year has been close. You go to some of those circuits where traditionally it's been a bit of a procession, and you were actually seeing cars following closer and the genuine overtaking. So I think that for me was a positive. I don't mind if there's one team dominating, if I'm honest. It's always nice to see a title fight go down to the end, but I actually would rather watch a dominant team like Red Bull delivering every weekend, absolutely smashing it. Than people lucking into wins all the time. When you've seen the dominance of Mercedes, admittedly that got a bit tedious after a while. However, when you've got a new team dominating, I don't mind that. I think it takes me a couple of years to get bored of that, and then
we've had a couple of years now, surely. So
we're 2 years in now, so maybe by next year it might get a bit boring.
Yeah, because I like, rightly so. I think with Mercedes, I thought it was getting to the point now where it was a bit much. Like, it couldn't have gone on, and I think we talked about it, hadn't we? Where I think like we said, it happens in the Premier League where you win for so long. Mm-hmm. I think there's kind of a subconscious kind of you subconsciously take your foot off the gas a little bit because you're so used to winning. You kind of almost subconsciously expect it to happen. And so I think that it was inevitable that Mercedes were at some point, I think with the new rules coming in, that they were going to, fall foul of that. But now that we've had Red Bull dominate they've dominated this year. Last year it was nice to see it go down to the wire, but I'm ready for a new team, or at least a new driver. I think that's maybe one of the things. I don't mind if a team is dominating if you've at least got that inter-team rivalry, because at least with Hamilton we've had Rosberg and we had a little bit of a fight with Bottas. So I think I'd prefer to at least see a couple of drivers in the mix, because Charles wasn't there this season. And I'm interested to hear what your take is on Charles, because obviously we know he's extremely talented, but do you think he's done enough this season? I mean, from your perspective as a driver, we know that he's quite emotionally charged. He's very self-critical when he makes a mistake. Do you see in him that as being like a positive trait? Do you see there being quite a bit of work for him to do in order to kind of achieve what Max is achieving at the minute?
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 things to think about, really. So attitude-wise, when everything's going his way, he's unbeatable, but that can be said for all of them, really. Yeah. Secondly, obviously with the reliability issue, that's caused various, stressful situations within Ferrari, and we now see a team boss that's been let go. But I think for me, he is a little bit too highly strung. And I think you've seen those emotional outbursts, which I get, of course, there's a load of pressure. But the reality is, what's it taken, use Verstappen as an example, what has it taken to move him from a very, very quick driver to a world champion? Yeah. It's taken someone like a Horner to calm him down, make him consistent, take the emotional 10% off the top.
Yeah.
And you just got to keep banging away. And if it doesn't go your way, fine, pick up a second or a fifth or a fourth or whatever. And I think that the problem with a driver that has that emotion and that can throw his toys out the pram if needed, team that with Ferrari, who has the national interests and the national stress and that Italian flamboyant way of work. Those things don't always work together. And I think that with Ferrari being so close for so long, it needs a little bit of hand-holding from the driver and a bit of guidance from the driver. Whereas when you look at Leclerc and Sainz together, both incredibly quick, both potential world champions, but who's like Schumacher picking that up when it all falls apart and driving it forward and pulling the people together and motivating the... Because speaking from experience, and it's something when you work with young drivers, you have to get them to stop doing, is getting on the radio and throwing fucks at everyone achieves absolutely nothing other than pissing everyone off. And when was the last, think back across 25 years of Schumacher, when did you ever hear him laying in? When did you ever hear him laying into the team or saying that it's not good enough? He would literally figure it out, get his head down, get everyone around a table, motivate everyone, figure out the problem, get to the test track, deliver it, and that professional way of work. And to be fair to Hamilton, a Hamilton of 10 years ago compared to a Hamilton of now, you can even hear in his voice that more mature. Yes, he'll have a whinge, and he might say that it's not good enough, but literally being on the radio, every expletive known to man, it never achieves what you think it's going to achieve. And I think that downward spiral that we saw from Ferrari this year, they obviously had a very strong start compared to the competition. And like always, their rate of development was not good enough. And when you say, okay, well, who's responsible for a car's rate of development? Ultimately, it's the drivers. And they need to have, and they can do it, don't get me wrong. They've got two drivers there that can lead and can win a championship at Ferrari. But they will have to have that Schumacher-esque professional, everything is down to, ultimately, I'm the one in the car, I've got to take responsibility for it. And I think when you see drivers, and ironically, Montoya, who I'm a massive Montoya fan, Montoya used to do it a lot of Williams. When it ever didn't go his way, he'd be out of that car, helmet on, marching across the pit lane, live on TV, laying into the pit wall just to make a point, and then off to the airport. And I think that has to be kind of just controlled a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see this year, or next year, who they choose to lead that.
Well, yeah, and we don't know what kind of car Ferrari are going to come out with next year, because obviously they've had a pretty good car this year, and they focus heavily on this for the last couple of years. They've written off seasons to make sure that this car was the best it possibly could be, and it's the strategists have just failed their job really through that year. I think, like Charles, we say with him having outbursts, I think some of them are kind of understandable, because if we go back to Monaco, that race was a mess anyway with all the rain, and we had shorter time. But he was asked to come into the pits when Sainz was already in. They're saying, box, and then they say stay out as soon as he starts turning in. And that's dangerous for starters anyway. And then he's going to get angry at that. I feel like that's an outburst you can kind of understand. But then I think it's another close to home track for him was France, when he lost throttle and went off the side of the track. That sort of outburst, I feel like he should. That's where he should be more like Michael, is just understanding what happened and then judging it that way, rather than just instantly screaming, no, what happened to the team, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think as you said, Monaco is a great example of the year. When you look at how championships are won, it's obviously consistency, professional, having a quick car, having consistent drivers, all of that stuff. But when you look at how championships are lost, it's stuff like that. It's simple, basic communication, and I've seen it happen before. Were they on the wrong radio channel? Were they actually communicating properly? All the little basic behind the scenes stuff has to be right, because they're so on the limit, these drivers and the teams and the strategists, all the teams back at base. For 60 odd people that they have there, they'll have 200 people back in Maranello all live on the radios. They've got drivers in the sim, and it's so much bigger than you see. All it takes is a basic error, and the whole thing falls apart.
Well,
and I think with Ferrari, they've always been a little bit temperamental when it comes to, oh, shall we give it a go? Oh yeah, okay, let's give it a go. And that's not, that's not how championships are won, with a bit of a finger in the air, like, oh, she had a bit of a risk. Oh, yeah, go on then, we'll have a bit of go, and it just doesn't work. And it's not rocket science.
That's what I've noticed about Ferrari. It's a really I mean, if you didn't know anything about cars or any, anything at all about Formula One or cars, for some reason, for somebody coming off Mars that didn't know who Ferrari was, you'd look at that and you'd think that they were a new team.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't look at that and say they're the oldest team in F1. They've been in this longer than anybody else. Because the mistakes that they make, you just think, well, surely you'd do that once, maybe, and then you'd never do it again.
Yeah.
But they repeated the same mistakes time and time again. So I'd be interested to know. I mean, do you think, either of you, do you think that this is going to change now that Mattia Binotto's gone? Is it something that was under his control, or do you think that he's just been made the scapegoat with him being, head honcho?
Well, ultimately, it starts and stops with him because he's the team boss, and he's paid good money to have that pressure and responsibility. But when you look and really analyze how a team is structured, there will be department heads and race strategy heads and people's roles within a race, actual race distance, literally from the lights going out to the checkered flag, who does what within that team. And of course, they will have pinpointed where the mistake started. Did we make a decision where we went that way, but reality is on the Friday afternoon we should have actually gone that way, but then that dictates your whole weekend. But then in a race, when you've got literally half a lap to make a decision, do we box or not? The teams that make the wrong decisions are the teams that are under the most stress. And as your analogy of if you came down and you'd not seen anything before and you just looked at how those teams performing, you can spot a team that are literally backs against the wall, like we have to get this right. And making decisions based on stress and pressure and not on experience, which they have just as much, if not more than anyone else, more than not goes wrong. And I think that you just see teams that are, if in doubt, make a quick decision. And that's a very risky game to play. And I think, like I said, with the pressure they have from Italy as a nation, the press, the media stress that they're under is unbelievable. And it, like we see with the English football team, the more pressure you put on, the worse they do. And I think it's exactly the same with Ferrari. The more the expectations there, when they've not been performing. So now, how long have they? Was it 07, the last championship they won with Raikkonen?
Yeah,
so
Raikkonen
07
was the last one.
So as you saw from when Scheckter, which was what in the 80s, it was 20 odd years to Michael winning a championship. By the last, the 15th, 16th, 17th year, the pressure was getting to the point it was just ridiculous, and we're now seeing that pressure build up again, and sadly, it's resulting in very reckless decisions.
Yeah, well, the pressures come from having some of the best drivers of all time driving for that team.
Yeah.
And I think there's more pressure now on the drivers than actually Mattia. I mean, I'm guessing a lot of people listening to podcasts and things like that now probably don't even know who he is, because he's the team managers. You might hear them on the radio every now and then, but you probably don't know what they look like, or unless it's Christian or Toto, you're probably not going to know who Mattia is. He's not constantly in the media.
Yeah, he's not. But it's one. But you could look at it and say that job is arguably the most important in terms of team bosses. Is probably it's probably the most sought after gig in the paddock, probably. And I think that when you look at Toto and the success he's had, Christian, the success they've had in the past and how long he's been there, there's very few team bosses. I think Horner is the longest serving of everybody in the paddock. I think
he is.
By
I think he is
quite
now,
a long shot.
Yeah.
And I think that this whole cliche of you're only as good as your last result, so to speak, that is as clear as anything with Ferrari, because at the minute you're not flavour of the month, you're gone.
Yeah, I think with Binotto, he always, to me at least, came across like a quiet sort of character. He never seemed to be, you think of Toto Wolff, he's nice on camera, but I feel like there's two sides to Toto. You don't want to get on his wrong side. And I think Horner's a little bit like a yappy little dog, isn't he?
Mhm.
You know, if he doesn't like something, he'll let you know.
You're right. Yeah.
And I don't think Bonotto's had that kind of killer instinct. And I think maybe that Ferrari are looking for or needing somebody that is going to step up to the plate and really kind of be a bit more of a leader. I feel like he was friendly with everybody and everybody liked him, but you know, he's their boss at the end of the day. You know, he needs to be leading that team and making the difficult decisions rather than trying to be liked by everybody. I think maybe that is where it's gone wrong, and it's always difficult, I think, to blame or place the blame solely on one person because it's a team sport at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think it's just part and parcel of the job. I think with you being the head of Ferrari, you know, it's you that has to face up to the music, which is a bit of a shame, I think. But I think they will benefit. Maybe Charles will benefit from having a more direct, forceful leader, you know, for want of a better.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when you look back at the leaders they've had, and again, apologies to the people listening if I get this wrong. Was it Arriva Bene who was before him, the grey haired chap? I think, and he was like a bulldog. You know, he was quite an aggressive guy, and he didn't take any shit from anyone, from my understanding. However, it didn't work. You know, so I think they have to have someone that's got the experience, and I think I've read in the media that potentially Fred Vasseur is potentially on the list. You know, and you've got to think back, you know, from when I was doing Formula 3, he was running, you know, successful Formula 3 teams. He was, I think, Hamilton's team boss in Formula 3 and GP2, running ART, I think, and ASM, I think it was in F3. And, you know, putting someone like him, he is a little bit like a Horner character, similar height as well.
He looks like a Bond villain,
but he's got that attitude he's got attitude and opinions based on experience. And I think that a lot of the issues with Ferrari, and it's very romantic, but a lot of the team bosses become team bosses at Ferrari because they've gone through the system from junior mechanics, you know, washing wheels 30 years ago. It's almost like the Japanese style of management within businesses. It's if you stay there long enough, you filter your way to the main job. And I think that reality is they need someone that the team trust. And I think that it'll be fascinating if you take a non-Ferrari kind of graduate, so to speak,
like a non-tifosi.
Yeah, and I'm sure Fred Vasseur obviously speaks Italian. He's multilingual, I'm sure. But if you take a non-Ferrari person, is what I'm trying to say, and bring them in, and he has the same attitude that he's had across his whole career, you'd be surprised, I think, the way that the media within Italy, the staff within Ferrari would have a different, probably more respectful. Again, being careful what I'm saying. It's almost like, right, this is a new way of working. All due respect, what we've been trying since 2007 doesn't work.
Yeah.
So if in doubt, you know, if you're trying to do the same thing every time and expect a different result, you're really an idiot, like you say. Yeah. So having someone that's got that experience and will come at it a completely different way, can manage drivers, won't take any shit from drivers, can sort the media out with one look. Like, you know, they always say with Horner, if in doubt, just throw Christian out there and he'll keep him happy for a bit. He can talk his way out of anything. And they need that, because when you look back at, I think I've seen many behind the scenes, you know, a weekend with Ferrari, and they follow the team boss around for a whole weekend. Other than during the race, the Ferrari team boss gets chucked in front of media and all he does is defend the results and come up with answers. And he just spends his entire weekend just being battered by the Italian media. And that is not how you drive a successful Formula 1 team forward.
It's like they're already starting on the back foot.
They're already started on the back foot. So I think you need a different approach. So I'd be tempted, you know, to take someone like a Fred Vasseur or a Horner character that's got a little bit of experience, and he's just going to have a different approach to it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how like Drive to Survive are going to depict the way that the last year's been for Ferrari entirely, because obviously we could speak about this for all day, because Ferrari had so much just media coverage this year. I feel like I've seen more Ferrari this year than I've seen in the last 5 years. I don't know if it's going to be a healthy thing for them, because they're going to have to battle that as soon as Drive to Survive gets released, because I can guarantee that Netflix is going to try and use that drama to drive it towards more people, especially through now like TikTok being so big. YouTube, everything. You're going to see it everywhere. I don't know if that's going to help the new team boss coming into it. He's going to have to deal with that media coverage too.
I think you'd be surprised that for everything good that Drive to Survive does, which is obviously growing the audience, changing the demographic, all of that stuff, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised how little attention the people within the sport actually give to that periphery of kind of the salesy kind of media side. You know, they are so focused on what they do. I think you'll find that because it's happened, and whoever comes in now ultimately won't be responsible for it, and they'll be planning for the future. And I think that I think in answer to your question with Drive to Survive, I think you'll have a mixture of how Ferrari are portrayed, because the reality is they had a very good car.
Yeah, it was a good car.
Very,
Great
very
car.
quick, especially over one lap. And I remember from Silverstone standing at the side of the track and watching them into Brooklands versus the Red Bulls and even the Mercs, to be fair. And it was mind-blowingly quick. And but that can be said for so many of Ferrari's cars that haven't won a championship. You know, they need the consistency. And they started the year very strong compared to the competition, but the reality is they weren't consistent enough through the whole thing. So I think it'll pick up more on the team mistakes, the stupid strategies, the cocked up pit stops, the fallouts of Leclerc. But I think the new team boss that comes in, I think that sort of stuff is just left to the general public to argue about. They're so focused on what they're doing. Yeah.
Well, that's Ferrari. That's one team, and that's probably like half an hour of coverage.
Exactly.
But if you move away from Ferrari and go towards what I think is going to be the most interesting team to watch next year, probably be McLaren.
Mm-hmm.
I think they've had a pretty good year. Lando's obviously performed really well. Danny Rick is gone now. Probably the hardest year of his life in Formula One, but he's kind of been on a downward spiral since he left Red Bull, and now he's returned.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you think it'll be with now Piastri coming into it and the competition between those two guys in comparison?
It's going to be an interesting one. Yeah, that's going to be a fascinating duel, I think. I mean, I really do rate Lando. I think he's very, very impressive. I'm a big fan of his. I think I am also a big fan of Danny Rick, but
he's shit, Danny Rick.
Yeah. But I think, I can think of various people, again, by pure coincidence. Montoya's one of them. Magnussen's one of them. Perez is one of them. Drivers that go to McLaren that just don't look like McLaren drivers.
No, yeah.
And it's just like, with all the will in the world, that had car crash, pardon the pun, written all over it. Yeah. Because you're somewhere like Red Bull, where you were flavour of the month. They had very quick cars. Verstappen then came along, and you just thought, okay, where else? And you tell me, what are the chances of the year that you decide that you want to jump out of a team? What are the chances that the perfect scenario is just waiting there with a seat empty? And so he would have gone good money, which we know, big team, but he really underestimated with Zach supporting Lando the way he was. Lando was clearly going to be number one. And I've been in those situations in the past. The minute that you've got the rookie or less experienced driver, the minute they're quicker, you're screwed. You are mentally fucked.
Yeah.
And I think you saw, how many years was he there? Two?
At McLaren, 2 years, yeah.
You saw 2 seasons of a driver that, when everything went perfectly, Monza, you can be yourself. But the car didn't suit him. The environment wasn't up his street. And you would literally turn up every weekend at that track thinking, well, let's just see what happens. And if you're going to a track thinking, let's see what happens, you're in big trouble. Because like going back to the Hakkinen era, Schumacher era, Verstappen now, all of the big players, they go to a race weekend knowing that they've got a sniff of winning. Yeah. And if they don't win, it's a guaranteed podium. Like, could you imagine Verstappen going to any race weekend this year thinking, well, let's just see how we get on? It just doesn't happen. The mentality is literally, we are going to go and absolutely annihilate everyone.
Yeah.
That's the approach you have to have just to win, not to win a championship, just to be quick every weekend. You have to go to those weekends thinking you are going to destroy everyone. So you can imagine the difference between Lando thinking that and Danny in a car he doesn't even like, thinking,
It's
"Oh, if I pick up a point, it'd be great."
it's
You're a second half off before you've even started.
it's funny that he went from a situation where the young driver was coming through
Into exactly the
into
same
exactly this exact
exactly.
same situation. Yeah,
So,
and now he's got no
yeah,
seat.
so you can
yeah.
say, what was his manager thinking? You've taken your driver out
Yeah.
of where he felt at home and put him into the exact same situation where he doesn't feel at home,
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
expect him to be clear.
I mean, I understand his reasons for moving, because I think when you see, like you said, I think when you see the young driver coming through and he's already quick, I think he knew that Red Bull were going to favour Verstappen. I mean, why wouldn't they? You've got a young driver who's just as fast. He's got more legs for them.
Mhm.
He's more marketable. Everybody likes Ricardo, but he's now early 30s. Basically F1 retirement age, and so I understand his reasons for moving, and I don't think we can be too harsh for understanding why he left Red Bull, because I think he thought that Renault, and rightly so. I think Renault kind of came across as though we're going to pump everything into because they could have pumped just as much money into that F1 program as Mercedes, and I think they almost did. And so I can understand his thought. Well, I can go there as the number one driver. I've not got this rookie coming through. They've got potentially the money to push this forward. They're wanting to achieve podiums as well. So am I. Maybe this is the gamble. It's a little bit like Hamilton moving from McLaren to Mercedes. Mercedes weren't tried and tested
At the time.
That was a gamble.
a big jump.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think he came at it from that point of view of, maybe this is a similar thing for me. This is it, because I don't think he would have won a championship if he'd have stayed at Red Bull.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think he would have won a championship there. However, if he'd stayed at Renault, now Alpine, he would have a car that was designed for him. He'd now be 3 years in. 4 years into a home environment, which he could have kind of carved and made his own.
Yeah.
Yes, he probably still would have had an Ocon as a teammate still, but he'd have managed that, I think. Alonso obviously would never have gone there, so he wouldn't have had to have worried about anyone like him.
Yeah.
But you just don't see very many in all sport. You don't see very many success stories when it gets difficult, jumping to someone else, and then that got a bit difficult, and there was a better offer, so we jumped again.
Yeah.
That just says you're not comfortable. Something's not right.
Yeah.
And if you look at, you've used Hamilton as a good example. He was born and bred through McLaren, and he had an opportunity, could see the vision for the future, and took a gamble. It worked. But when you look back to Schumacher as a classic example, 3 years at Benetton, winning races, won his first championship, won his second championship, jumped to Ferrari in an absolute horror show of a car, worked his ass off, and took him 4 years till 2000 to win a championship. So those 4 years of making a car that suited him, building a team of people around him, the Ross Brauns, the John Tots, all that lot, that was Team Schumacher. That's what you've got to do. And I think that's what Ricardo and his management should have done when he jumped ship from Red Bull, was just pick a side and make it work. So now he would be 4 years in, and he would basically be having that Alpine car now suited to him.
Yeah.
Factory team, and that just would have been better than jumping into Lando's world at McLaren.
Where could you have seen him in that scenario, though? I mean, where realistically do you think Alpine and Ricardo could have been sat at the end of the season had he stayed there and done that? You look at where Alonso's finished in the Drivers' Championship. Do you think it would be further on because they'd have developed the car together? And he would have...
Yeah, I think it would have been. I think, like I said, you'd be 4 years down the road of creating a car around you. And I think I can't stress enough how important that is, because when you're jumping in a car that is basically set up by 2 drivers, and it's always a compromise, because no driver's driving style is the same. And that's one of the beauties of sports car racing, is that you're sometimes 2, if not 3 drivers, and you've got to pick a setup that works for everyone, from a 18-year-old kid out of Formula 3 to a 65-year-old gentleman driver. It's something that works for all of them. With Formula 1, if you're going to win a championship, and you're going to dominate, you have to have a car that is solely built for what you want, works for the tyres, works for the temperature, works in quali, works in over a race distance. And I think if you're not confident and you're jumping ship all the time, you haven't got that time to literally build a foundation to then build a successful car on top of. So I think, in answer to your question, I think he would now be 4 years down the line, as we've seen with Alpine, probably being best of the rest, but consistently. Whereas this year, or last year, he could win a race, but wasn't that consistent. This year, he was on a good day, 6th, 7th, 8th, but reality is 12th, 13th, 14th. And I think he would have been consistently best of the rest.
Just been comfortable.
And still in Formula 1.
That's the main
and
part. We know he's listening.
That's the bit you forget, is that
podcasts.
He'd still been Formula 1.
Yeah. Well, we slate Danny every single week
really?
on the podcast.
Why?
Yeah. Because we hate him.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
No, we don't actually hate him. It was just a run. I don't even know how that joke started, actually. It's just on the first
No, I think he will, but before we get off him, I think he will be back.
Yeah,
I
think so.
He'll do a year out, and I think there'll be, because I heard rumours, and Giovinazzi is where I'm getting with this. So Giovinazzi really hasn't achieved anything in Formula 1. However, he still picks up the odd drive and test drive because of experience. These cars are so difficult to get your head round. Teams now favour a more consistent, not average, they're all good, don't get me wrong, but someone that can be at 95% of the car's limit, but has the knowledge, the system knowledge, everything, can do it, rather than starting from scratch every weekend.
Yeah.
And I think that will work in his favour in a year's time. If there's a seat available, you either have a choice of, do we take a rookie, potentially with money, but who's never done a Formula 1 weekend in his life, has never driven these systems before, or do we stick Danny Rick in it and he'll get it?
Yeah, well, we're going towards that in different teams with other drivers coming in. Like Nick de Vries hasn't really achieved anything in Formula 1, but he gets those odd occasions where he can test, and Hulkenberg as well.
Yeah.
So we're going to see them.
Hulkenberg, classic example.
He's a great example of it. But what do you think? So one person now can't understand these cars totally. It's impossible because there's so much technology now. So you look back at the great drivers when you had like Lauda around, he could feel everything in the car and he knew what to change. And he had that input in the team. Drivers don't have that input anymore, so they're relying on pure talent.
Yeah, they are. I think it's the skill now, I think, is wider spread. So you've got to have the best engineers, ultimately, that design, or designers that design a good concept, like I said, a foundation. Come like this time of year, the designers are earning their money now. Like if they get this bit wrong, as we found with Mercedes last year, and did I read this week that Mercedes team knew they had a crap car the first run of the first day. And that is true. So those designers, if they've got the last, I mean, obviously they work year on year ahead of time. So if they've got the last year wrong and the finishing touches they're doing now wrong, it doesn't matter how motivated the driver is or how hard he's been training or how good he's getting on with his engineer. Because if the core concept of the car's wrong, you're just playing catch up until Abu Dhabi. So your year's done before it's even started.
Yeah.
And I think that it's got to be now a mold of everything working right. There's so many more people now than there were in Lauda's day. You know, then it was a chief designer, chief engineer, chief mechanic, and as long as they all knew what they were doing and they spanned a proper car that they just gave to a driver, I believe the cars were harder to drive back then. So being at the limit was a lot more difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Whereas now, relatively, obviously the cars are a hell of a lot quicker now, but with all the systems, power steering, so much grip, it's like a simulator. And if you've got the right balance in the right car, the drivers can do it, and it's okay. Whereas in those days, it was like MotoGP. It was so much of a risk, and the danger was so much higher, and they were just monsters, those cars. So there was a little bit left more to the driver. Whereas now, ultimately, whoever wins the championship is the best package, and I hate that term, but it's the best of everybody doing their job. And that, again, that comes back to what we're talking about team bosses. You've got to pull all those people together, otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah, I wanted to go back into McLaren briefly because we've got Oscar Piastri coming through. We've been a big fan of Oscar Piastri, haven't we? for obvious reasons.
Yeah, there's a lot of hype though, isn't there?
There is, but this is another question I wanted to ask you, because there's been a lot of hype, but he's won, what was it, Formula 4, and then the year after moved to Formula 3, won that in his rookie season. Then the year after that moved to Formula 2, won that in his rookie season. Is that not something a bit special?
It is, but that's exactly what Nico Hülkenberg did.
And he won the World Championship, though.
Hulkenberg.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said Rosberg.
Hulkenberg. but also Hamilton. You know, he went through every championship and won it. But sadly, I think you're right in a way that it shows pure skill, because all of those championships are what we call one-make championships. So the cars are all the same.
Yeah.
You pick them up at the factory, your teams take them away, and then it's up to each of those individual teams what they do with them. But you can't make new aero. You can't really do a lot of design work on the cars. It's basically actual setup, you know, springs, dampers, right sides, wings, all that sort of stuff. So from a driver perspective, it teaches the driver how to manage a race weekend, how to communicate with an engineer. But when you take them out, so I've said from the beginning, you know, you could have Formula 4, Formula 3, Formula 2, but the jump to Formula 1 is like, it's massive.
I suppose, yeah.
And I think that there are drivers that jump straight out of one into the next, like Hamilton was a classic example. However, I know for a fact that the year that he came into Formula 1, which was 2007, I believe.
Yeah.
And he was, you know, teammates to Alonso, was within a couple of points of winning the championship, won races, on the podiums, dominate. You know, he was good.
Yeah.
There was an option for him to be in the year before, but Ron said no, because he didn't believe that the advantage they had with the car was as big.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I read about that.
And I think that if he'd jumped, and that was 2007, but if he'd, was it 2009 that McLaren had a really bad car? The year
that was the change of regulations again.
Car.
Yeah.
So just think that if Hamilton's first year had been 2 years later,
Might not be the same driver.
None of his championships would potentially have happened. He could have literally come in, bog standard, average driver, next. So the timing is perfect. So irrespective of what Piastri's done prior, he needs to actually start mentally from scratch, because what he's achieved doesn't count for anything. Because if that car's not quick enough, he'll be out of that door quicker than you can say, you know, court hearing, which is all he's done so far. So I do believe he's very good.
I'm sensing some hostility.
I do believe he's very good, because you can't be good and achieve what he's achieved. Like, that's spectacular.
Yeah.
But when you look at Hulkenberg, he achieved all of that every year, won a championship, and I witnessed that. I was doing, what was I doing at the time? Probably World Series or Formula 3. So I was in amongst his era, so to speak, and I remember thinking he was good. But because of the cars he then subsequently found himself in, that potential and skill doesn't give you the opportunity.
But
it doesn't necessarily dissipate, but you don't have the opportunity to showcase it. So my very long answer to what you've asked is Piastri's season will only be as good as the car that they give him.
But you say that, however, the exception to that rule has to be George Russell, because he came into the worst car of the grid, but he was able to put on display his sheer talent by way outperforming the capabilities of that car. So I think if you are that good of a driver, surely it's clear to see, even if you've got a terrible car. Because I mean, if Piastri comes in and that McLaren next season, fingers crossed it's not, but if that McLaren is 8th out of all the cars next season, but he outperforms Norris week in, week out, surely that's going to promote him to...
Yeah, so that's the key factor. So, for example, with Russell, people like him, which is it sounds stupid, but that is one of the hardest bits, that if people come in to that world and you're just not liked, you're screwed. It doesn't matter how quick you are. But he was able to be a nice kid, got on with the right people, but annihilated his teammate. And as we saw with Webber at Minardi, Alonso at Minardi, you can think of many others, when they started their career in a slow back of the grid car, as long as you annihilate your teammate, you're good to go. So completely agree with what you've just said. I've said his success will only be as good as the car they give him, and that's on results. But for him to stay in Formula 1, even if that McLaren's awful, he will have to annihilate Norris.
Yeah.
And that's where the really interesting battle is. When you look at championship, when you look at race weekends where there's inter-team rivalries at like 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th on the grid, that is all about keeping your job. And that's where real pressure is.
Do you know what it reminds me of? This Piastri-Norris kind of tie-in next season. It's a little bit like a boxing match where you've got two boxers undefeated. One of them is going to lose out because they are. Because either Norris is going to be shown up and he's not the talent we all thought he was, which I think is going to be difficult to do, or the same for Piastri.
Yeah.
You know, it might be, well, yeah, he's really good, but Norris is better and he's already here.
Exactly.
So
yeah, I think it's always interesting because I think it kind of gets overlooked, but when you look at the Bottas Hamilton era at Mercedes, they obviously had a very dominant car. So the majority of those 4 or 5 seasons, Hamilton's only opponent or real threat on a race weekend was his teammate. When you took when you took Hamilton out of that seat and you put Russell in it, and Russell was quicker than Bottas and should have won that race after an apparent puncture, which wasn't real. That was that showed what Hamilton had actually been trying to beat every weekend.
Oh,
I love Bottas. I think you actually look quite like him. It's the first time I've seen you in the flesh. You've got a bit of a Bottas thing going on. But we'll talk about that later.
There's one to put on TikTok. Tom's got the Bottas face. Look at the camera, Tom.
Yeah, blue steel down the lens. But what that did, it showed you suddenly that, hang on a minute, if all Hamilton's been doing for the last 5 years is beating someone in Bottas that could be beaten by a Russell at the first opportunity, that says a lot about the performance. And then it's been fascinating when you then put Russell and him together for the first full season. He's beaten him.
Yeah, Russell's beating him on points. I mean, that is
so.
A
What do you
huge
take
thing.
from that? For those years that he's winning those championships, and it was basically the 2 Mercedes drivers against each other, and with Rosberg as well. You know, Hamilton, don't get me wrong, is incredible. You know, I've been on the same grid as him in Formula 3. I've stood at the side of racetracks and watched him. Without doubt, probably the most talented person that's ever driven a Formula 1 car. However,
something to say, isn't it? Especially with Senna.
A lot of that has been around, like with Schumacher, like with Senna at certain parts. The car has to also be as good as it can. He's always had the best car
since the hybrid era started.
And when you put Hamilton in a McLaren that wasn't that great, where did he finish?
Yeah,
the same as everyone else. So it's really fascinating with Russell coming. You know, we started this talking about Russell. I completely agree. Your reputation is based on how you can perform against your teammate, but the hidden bit of that is, but how good is your teammate? If you can annihilate a Latifi every weekend.
This is why I'm holding the microphone. I've got something to say about it.
You know, that was expected. And that was good.
Distracting away from that pure talent of speaking of Lewis, Hamilton, everything like that, and Russell, they're all great talents. And you go to Williams with the GOAT, who we've had to say goodbye to. Latifi's gone. One of the best drivers of our generation. I mean, how can you ever have a good opinion on that guy? I mean, Albon outperformed him easily. There was just no competition there. I mean, I don't what track was it on where Latifi turned off into like a. It wasn't even part of the track, and he turned. How do you not know the track?
Yeah.
I mean,
well, it's weird.
I mean, what was that? Yeah, in Japan, he just turned off.
I think it's a weird one.
What happened there as well? Like, you drove off the track.
Yeah, it's a hard one because there always seems to be, even though there's only limited number of seats on that grid, there always seems to be one driver that the public think shouldn't be there.
Yeah,
you know, Mazepin or whatever his name was a classic one. Sadly, Latifi was another. And obviously, I know there's a lot of money involved in both those situations with the teams and stuff, but there's always one villain. And the reality is, Latifi, like all of them, you know, they'd been training, he'd be working hard, he wouldn't have left no stone left unturned, you know, but it just doesn't click. And the reality is, he'll come out of Formula One and he'll go and do WEC, and he'll annihilate people. Because those drivers, I know, and people disagree with me, and I don't really care. But people all of the drivers on that grid, and there's a few exceptions that don't quite make the cut, even the ones at the back, you can't fathom how good they are. Yeah. And it's like, even the guys that are a second and a half off, and they're consistently P12, 13, 14, 15, if you sat in a car with them and they did one lap in a road car, give them a Vauxhall Astra diesel around Silverstone, and you sit next to them, you get out that car and you wouldn't quite believe what you just watched. It is unbelievable. Yeah. And I think that when you then chuck in 1,000 brake horsepower on slicks in the wet, in a car that costs 20 million quid, week in, weekend, round Monaco, round these, you just can't quite compute what even the slower guys are doing. And the reality is, the slower cars are even harder to drive than the quick ones. Those guys are the Latifis and the Albons of the world are actually working harder over 65 laps to physically manhandle a bad car around a track than a good one. Yeah. And sadly, there's always, like I said, there's always a villain.
Well, somebody.
And I think that this year, but having said that, this year, I think, you've got De Vries, who I think's great, really good. I think he definitely deserves a seat.
Definitely, yeah.
And I think you've got the Piastri situation playing out there, which is going to be fascinating. I just think, and I don't know why I'm going to say it, I've got a feeling that if the Piastri situation if he's not quick, I think all of the media hype of the court case and all of that contract stuff, they will turn on him.
Yeah.
So quick.
Logan Sargent, it's coming in. But
yeah, true.
The thing is, with the slow guys, I mean, I still think I could beat Latifi. I'm just going to put that out there. And if he wants to race, I'll happily do it. Anyway, but somebody every year has to come last.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't matter who it is. You could have 20 Lewis Hamiltons. Lewis Hamilton will be at the bottom of the grid.
But the crazy thing is, though, someone is always, obviously,
if you do the maths,
someone is always at the back of the grid, but it's only when it's one person all the time.
Yeah, I suppose that's a good point.
That it becomes an issue. Whereas you had some case, I think it was, I'm trying to think what year it was. It was the year that Fisichella was at Force India and he nearly won at Spa. I want to say it was like 07, 08, something like that. And I remember it was the first time at Spa I think all of the cars were covered in qualifying by about a second. And they're all quick. Mm. And it was just bad luck if you were the wrong end of a tenth, you were last. You know? Whereas you get some years where, 2 or 3 seconds off and, you're 7 tenths off. If you're last, you're 7 tenths off 19th, So it does vary, but I think it's only when there's one team or one driver that's consistently, I think of over the years, people like Alex Young at Minardi, no matter what car they gave him, he was always a second off his teammate, So I think it's, Sargent will have a big challenge. I think
I don't know too much about Sargent.
Yeah, I mean, he's very highly thought of, but again, rookie, challenging team environment, a team that are desperately trying to get back to where they were. And I'm a big Williams fan, but they deserve to be back where they were. But when you've got a team that are up against it, a new driver, so Albon's staying as team.
Yeah, Albon's staying at Williams. Yeah,
so he'll be hard for him to beat. So there's every chance that he's probably going to come in and get regularly beaten and be at the back and be last, sadly. And that takes you take a lot of hits mentally from, coming in as a rookie and thinking, Jesus, I'm last every weekend. And that, not many drivers can deal with that.
But having said that, in the grand scheme of things, at least coming last in a season of Formula One will set you up for years and years worth of endurance racing.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, absolutely. I saw myself that the higher up the single seater ladder you can get, when you jump ship to something else, the higher, when you jump off that ladder, the higher up the next ladder you land, effectively.
You could actually get paid when you go to endurance
he would easily fall into a factory drive at WEC, and I think a Latifi, obviously Vettel's in a different scenario now, for argument's sake, when Alonso, Vettel, those sorts of drivers, Rosberg should have done it and for some reason didn't. If you jumped out of Formula One, you'd probably still earn Formula One money, if not a little bit less in WEC, because of who you are and what you can bring, Vettel could easily go and drive a factory Porsche in LMP1 or the equivalent, whatever that championship's called now. Be paid good Formula One money and do another 5-10 years there if you wanted to.
Well, he'll probably get. I'd imagine Sargent's probably going to be on a higher wage than majority of the drivers on that grid, other than the elites, just because he's American, and that's a huge thing to have a USA driver coming into a seat. I know we've had Stroll, who's Canadian and things like that, but he's a bit of a robot. We don't particularly like Stroll either. I mean, he's not incredible as we could see. He's good in the wets, but yeah, Sargent is American, and the marketability is huge, especially for an English team of Williams.
When you turn on the conversation of driver salaries, it's a difficult one because it depends on the structure of the deal, really. So, when you've got someone like Sargent, who I'm assuming, I could be completely wrong, I'd assume he's bringing some sort of money to that drive. So his salary effectively is going to be a little bit of a
that's kind of what I mean, though.
A cut off the top of whatever he's bringing,
But it's maybe not his wage, but I think it'd be more like the sponsorship that he'd bring into the team.
So that's really Williams' job, is when they've got a marketable driver.
Yeah,
they have to make the most of it. So they have to have a marketing team and a business development and a partnership team at Williams that are now literally trying to break America.
Yeah,
because they've got a, with Vegas, Miami, all that stuff. If they can't do it now, then they'll never do it.
Yeah.
See, I thought the best thing for Williams to do, in my opinion, my professional opinion, I thought the best thing that Williams could have done was to hire De Vries. Because I thought, you've got Albon, who is proven to be a pretty handy driver. De Vries, who we already know, he's obviously won Formula E, is a good driver, and he's proven himself, especially coming in and racing Monza is unbelievable. And so, for me, I thought Williams would have been in a great position. They had two really good drivers because they've got this new Doralton capital, who have clearly got enough money to be able to fund the team over the next few years. I don't know how much they actually need a sponsored driver.
Yeah, it's so hard because it's always what image the teams give. But I'm assuming, based on historical drivers that they've had, that Williams may have a business model that is one paid driver and one driver that brings budget.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. So that immediately
a paid driver and a paid driver.
Yeah. So you've when you go back, that you had some years, the awful years, when they'd have Bruno Senna and Maldonado both bring in huge money because they just needed the cash.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got a driver that they need a driver that can develop the car, has experience in Albon, but if you then have a rookie that can bring budget, anywhere from 10 to 20 million quid is a normal going rate if you want to sit at the back of the grid. That's probably the model they've got. And I know it sounds a bit crazy, but there probably is. De Vries, with his experience, who he's managed by, his association with manufacturers, he'll want paying.
Yeah.
Genuine money.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that would have swung it quite easily. But you're right. If it'd been a blank sheet of paper and there's zero budget issues, you'd have taken De Vries every day of the week.
Because you'd think that would speed the development of the car up and ergo speed up when they're going to start getting more of a return on investment from being high up the grid. So I thought that would have been the most sensible route. Because I understand the pay driver thing. I thought that having this budget cap in place now and having it slowly diminish each year would lead to less and less of these paid drivers, because more and more teams can affordably meet that budget criteria. And so I just thought, well, surely with that coming in and Doralton Capital, because they're earning billions upon billions, the investment funds, and so I'd have thought that they would have been able to at least maybe gone, well, we can fund this for 5 years without any form of recuperation financially, and then by that point, if we've had two really good drivers, we developed the car to be a high mid-table team, then we can then start to recoup some of our investment. But obviously, it sounds like
I mean, it could have worked the other way around. When I say he's bringing money, I don't mean that disrespectfully at all, because ultimately someone has to pay for it. Exactly. But it could have worked the other way around, and I remember Jordan always used to be like Eddie Jordan always used to be like this. He would find a sponsor, and Benson and Hedges springs to mind, that they, I believe, always insisted when possible on having a British driver. So I know Damon's deal at Jordan was dictated by the sponsors, but he wasn't bringing the money, but the sponsors dictated
But yeah,
the nationality
inadvertently
of the
bringing
driver.
money,
So
yeah.
you may find that with Williams's experience and knowledge of the future, the plan, like you say, the business plan, the model for the next 5-10 years, they may have already broken America. They may have sponsors ready to go because it's growing in the US that have said, yeah, it is 20 million quid. However, we need an American driver.
Yeah.
So he's not bringing the money. I could be completely wrong. He may be getting a wage. You might be completely right. However, the money that's coming in is only based on him being in that seat. So that's quite a common model as well. So,
but
right.
will that make much of a difference though? Is that extra 20 million when it's a budget capped season make more of a difference than having a faster development curve with two good drivers?
It is if you haven't got it. Yeah.
I'm certain that they've got that money.
They may
but
have.
I must be wrong.
They may have.
Otherwise, why would they?
Yeah, they may have. But I think it's always hard to tell from the outside, and they're not necessarily in this position because they're not necessarily manufacturer backed. But for example, Audi, Porsche, Ferrari, Mercedes, all the major manufacturers, they will sit down around a board table at the end of the year and say, right, our racing budget for next year is X.
Yeah.
And even, obviously Red Bull would underwrite everything, but the individual personal sponsors that those teams do is basically filling the gap between the manufacturer money and what they need to go racing every weekend.
Yeah.
So you do see some teams that have sometimes run very little branding on the car, very little genuine sponsorship money, and that's because
McLaren in 2018 there's nothing on that
they just
car.
Have it. So it will all be dictated by how much the Dorrant Capital can actually pump into that. And if they're saying to them, well, this is what we can underwrite, and we'll underwrite the year, so it'll happen, and everyone will get their wage, and everyone will have a job. However, they'll underwrite the budget, but that's in the understanding that Williams management can, over the period of the season, bring in, 50% of the budget or 40% of the budget, in which case their contribution would obviously be lessened.
Yeah.
So there's no set way of doing it, but I think you may find that there's always more than one reason why a driver's put in the car at the back of the grid, and it's normally financially dictated or sponsor related.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's I've always wondered this because it gets to a point, and Williams are a prime example of this. It gets to a point where what are you actually getting out of Formula One?
Mm-hmm.
I know, are they, they won't have turned a profit for year after year after year, and they're not. I just don't see what business sense there is. I mean, you can only do it as a passion when you've got that many people for so long. I feel like it's you have to make money from Formula One, otherwise why are you there? It's a business at the end of the day.
Yeah, it is, but the passion for the sport can't be underestimated. I mean, it's an incredible, having worked in it for 15 or so years, it's an amazing environment to wake up and go into every day and earn a living from. And I think that, yes, of course, all the teams want to go and win races, and this can be said from Formula One to Formula Ford and grassroots motorsport. If you have a business model that your services can be charged out and you generate an income from, and it pays your mortgage or it pays your school fees or whatever it is, then it's worth doing.
Yeah.
And I think that if you asked however many hundreds of people work at Williams, would you rather come here every morning and develop a car and go racing every other weekend and have that thrill and enjoyment of it, or we don't bother?
Yeah.
I know what they'd all say. Yeah. And I think that the winning has become, and again, I witnessed this in sports cars many a time. You either have teams that put every single possible nut and bolt and person and everything together because they're going to win, and they're going to win races and they're going to win championships, or you've got in most championships, the other 70% of the teams that actually just want to have a business, enjoy motorsport, pay the salaries, pay the truckie, pay the overheads of the factory and just go racing. And that's what it comes down to, and that can be said for the majority of athletes sport. I mean, admittedly, there's not many sports where the money involved is quite what it is.
Yeah.
But there has to be that element of passion and love for it to keep coming back every weekend and getting your ass kicked. It's really strange concept to think of, but
it's a huge team in Formula One. Obviously, Williams is a massive name, but then with the increase in popularity of Formula One over the last few years through COVID and things as well, even through those years of COVID, what the team like Audi are coming into this sport in 2026, I think it is. The only reason I can see Audi would want to come into the sport is because that popularity gain is so big that the money's got to be there. So for Williams, there must be something. And you're probably better off being in last place than being a mid-table team like Alfa Romeo who are getting replaced. Because you got more media coverage, and that is kind of the way Formula One is now. Is the more coverage you've got, the better chance of staying in the sport you've got.
Yeah, you're completely right. I think the business model again going forward and the growth of any business sport is always the key factor when looking for investments. When you've got, I can think of Porsche and Audi have been talking about doing Formula One as long as I've been alive, I think. And I think that they will have made that decision based on some very interesting factors, both probably quite similar, which is the forward growth and commitment of the sport, the popularity of other brands and manufacturers compared to them. Are they losing market share now because they're not in it?
Yeah.
And I think they are now. 100%. And I think over the years, they've been able to gain through sport, and they're completely, unimaginable contribution and commitment to sports car racing that those two manufacturers have had, Porsche and Audi, which can never be underestimated and has created so many opportunities for so many teams and drivers and fans to watch that success. But they're now at that point where I think they've probably gained as much as they can from that. And the only other, mountain to climb is Formula One.
That is the only reason I've not bought a Porsche yet. So.
Oh, really?
But there was a news story that came out today of I think he's a Chinese businessman who's looking to invest into Formula One. It came on the BBC News this morning. But he's looking at it as purely a financial thing. And so he said, well, the popularity of it has grown so much with things like Drive to Survive. And it's now, for him, he seems it's the right time to jump in and make a financial commitment to get return on his investment. And I'm sure there's a few companies out there that have got the capital that would also like to do the same. But do you think that will? I mean, do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, for me personally, I would rather have manufacturers in Formula One rather than businessmen.
Yeah, I think it's
a bit like the Racing Point thing. I mean, what?
Yeah,
what was the Racing
it's a strange
Point
one. So there's always been, even with manufacturer teams, and I can think of McLaren as an example. There's always behind the scenes still been key wealthy individuals involved. Not necessarily, I'm not saying they're pumping money into it, but there's always key people within teams that success is depending on. And I think, I'd like to see what involvement he actually has on the day-to-day decision-making of the race team itself. But I think that the cynic in me, again, from having worked in the industry, whenever I see a great news story, you've got wealthy, billionaire Chinese man or Asian wants to get into the sport, see it as an investment, that will be dictated, but that success story will be dictated by who he trusts, which team get him on board, how long term he's thinking that this return on investment is going to take.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, and again, the budget cap will make a significant impact on how long that will take. But I think you'll find that if there hadn't have been a budget cap, it's a never-ending
Yeah.
pool of.
Yeah.
It's a bottomless pit of how much money.
Well, yeah, so what was Mercedes spending about $460 million a season?
Exactly.
Yeah,
whatever you've got, and the classic cliche of in every other championship, it's like, well, however much you've got, we'll spend it.
Yeah.
And that is 100% true.
Mm.
And there's very, very, wealthy, high net worth individuals from around the world that go racing every weekend in other championships, and they have to call it a day at some point because it just gets silly.
Yeah.
And I think that the budget cap will obviously change things significantly, but I think that success story will depend on which team marketing department get to him first.
Yeah.
And I think that
there's
it does make me cringe a little bit, but I think it's a great story, and I think it is testament to, again, like you say, the good work that Formula One have done and the growth of it and the potential of the sport and getting into other regions and all that sort of stuff. But it just does make me cringe a little bit. I can just picture a broken man in 10 years' time sat at the side of with a Formula One pass hanging off his neck thinking, Jesus Christ.
Because there was talk of him potentially entering his own team.
Yeah.
To be in an 11th championship team.
Yeah, but again, it's he should sit down with Gene Haas and ask how that worked out.
Well, Gene Haas, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, is relatively poor.
Yeah,
in the Formula One world,
which just shows how crazy the world is. Gene Haas has been hugely successful in the US in racing, and then comes to Formula One, and obviously they've had good results in the past and whatnot, but just shows how much of a jump from any other world of motorsport Formula One is, and it's still at the point where he has to underwrite the team and they're fighting.
I think Elon Musk should come into Formula One.
Well, there you go. Yeah. But again, it would be.
He's got the
however
money.
Much money
he's got the money and he's got the
spend
brains.
Yeah.
He could just be a one-man team in Formula One. It's just him.
I mean, in all seriousness, though, how the hell he hasn't entered Formula E?
I am surprised by that. I think he probably just thinks it's just too easy.
Yeah. What's the point?
Because I mean, what they're only developing 300 brake horsepower, and they still swap the battery halfway around the race. Is that finished?
Well, I think it's.
I don't watch.
I think
Formula
for him, people like that. It's funny. The sport has so much history, and so much. When you look back over 50, 60, 70 years of Formula One, it's amazing what you remember, and I just don't want the sport to now get into this era of being remembered for the money that's pumped into it and the random team bosses. And when you look back over the year, you've obviously always had that. The people that have owned, that bought Jordan into, Force India or whoever it was, all those, those sorts of people don't, I think, belong in the sport. I think there's so many incredible people that work their way up through the sport. I'm not talking about drivers. I'm talking about team bosses, engineers, mechanics, truckies, all those sorts of people, commentators, media personnel. They work so hard. And I think the only time Formula One frustrates me is when there's kind of non-racing influence and non-racing personnel trying to sidestep all of that hard work and just go straight in at the top. Come on. Do better than that.
I saw, this is an interesting stat for you, at the start of the year. So obviously this is our first year podcasting entirely. We were in the top 50% of podcasts with 10 listeners an episode, right? And that's crazy because podcasting wasn't big, especially in this kind of area of Formula One. It's not a massive thing yet. By the end of this year, we're in the top 5% just for having 50 or 60 listeners. And that's just because the amount of podcasts that have been created through the year has quadrupled.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of what's happening with the viewership every year. Is that it's gaining so quickly now, and that's why these teams are going to want to be a part of that. And I think the businessman coming into that has to be thinking, if the money's got to come back, these teams have to be making that money to be able to stay in the sport.
Yeah, I think it's always a case of how the long-term prospects are. There's always been periods, and again, my years kind of have all merged into one, but there's periods of when Formula One was going to break up and Ferrari were going to go off and do their thing, and there was going to be a breakaway series and this, that, and it's nice.
What was
but
the
it's
football
nice
one
to say
called? The Super League, the F1
it's
Super
nice
League.
to say that those days seem to have gone, and I think that they've all realised quite quick that post Bernie that there is a plan, and it's not just one bloke's opinion.
But I feel like 90% of that has come from Netflix. I
Yeah,
feel like that's what's
potentially,
united
yeah,
the teams.
but
Going,
but
oh,
I
actually,
think
we've got a
that
good thing going here.
the Bernie era always had that element of he could just make a decision at the drop of a hat, and if you weren't sat down when the music stopped, you were screwed, type thing. You know what I mean? Whereas now
That's
I
a good
think
way
the
of putting it.
teams and manufacturers, and that's a signal for Audi.
Yeah.
They're not stupid. They will only make that decision because they've had concrete proof of what the next decade, minimum decade,
Yeah.
has shown. And I think that wouldn't have been achievable under Bernie, because I think he had so much control and literally could make a decision based on absolutely nothing. Because I remember going to the Grand Prix one year, to the British Grand Prix, and the hype was that Formula One's done.
Yeah.
And Bernie was being followed around the paddock by all the reporters, and Martin, was there interviewing him, saying what's going on, and he's basically saying, well, teams can't really decide what the plan is, so who knows? Well, you can't tell your shareholders and your board members that we don't know what the plan is next year.
I mean, I'm interested because this Eccleston documentary is coming out, isn't it? It's
really?
So they've
done
a documentary.
It'd
be really good. Yeah. So it's done by the same guy that did the Senna.
Great.
The Senna one. So it's the same type of.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that will be really interesting because he is quite a character.
Yeah.
And so to see what kind of went on behind the scenes and how it developed, I think would be really good.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems to me, I mean, I've read interviews with him from years ago, and sometimes you think, oh, he's fairly level-headed. Then all of a sudden you hear a news story and it's just like fucking ridiculous, something stupid that he said.
But I mean, like I said, I've never met the guy, but I've had team bosses that have worked for him at Brabham and been, friends of his and stuff. And everything I hear was he was an incredibly clever guy.
Yeah.
Could really, that wheeler dealer, secondhand car dealer kind of mentality to everything.
Yeah.
And if there is a documentary, that'll be fascinating. It'll be really good.
Yeah, I am looking forward to seeing that, as controversial as Eccleston is.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one other thing that I wanted to talk about from this season, and it's, do you think that these regulation changes and the way that they were set out have worked? Because they were introduced at a point where, obviously 2021 was one of the closest seasons we've had, literally going down to the last race. So we had that convergence of concepts for so long. Was it the right time to bring these regulations in? And do you think that they've had a positive effect?
Well, I think it depends on what sort of racing fan you are. I think that if you ask going back to Netflix, the Netflix generation, they couldn't really care. They don't know any different. These cars are incredibly quick. The racing's getting close, wheel to wheel. Passing's more frequent, whether it's DRS or not. The vibe is great, so yeah, why not? But I'm certainly not in that camp. I could, the number of YouTube videos that pop up on my feed of best sounding V10 onboard laps, and you look back to the Williams 01, 02, 03, it makes me cringe, and it really upsets me to think how we've, and I don't mean this lightly, destroyed Formula One.
Yeah.
And I mean that.
Yeah.
I mean, of course I watch it and I go and I enjoy it, and it's still an amazing thing to behold, Formula One. But the nature of the sport is that it always changes. Year on year, new regulations, new this, new that. But that shouldn't be the case. And I know we've got to be responsible and sustainable with the environment and looking at all those elements. But sadly, the sport, through social media, the sport now listens to the opinions and the influence of people that don't really know what
they don't watch it. They don't watch it.
What their opinions, what's it based on? Nothing.
But they're like minimizing risk, aren't they? And obviously the environment, I get all of that. That makes sense. But even other sports like football, you used to have back in the day 2-foot snapping ankles everywhere. Like it's just a pure like physical sport.
Yeah, but if you look at, and let's use football, with the World Cup now, let's use football as an example. Over the last, let's not even talk 60 years, over the last 20 years, how have the rules, the fundamental rules of football changed? Not massively. We've got VAR, obviously Obviously, those VAR can't tackle from behind, can't really push a player, etc. Yeah, it's basic stuff, but the concept of how the game is played has not changed.
Yeah, so the fundamental's still there, but the sport's developed into something completely different.
Whereas if you take and I think we've talked about this before, if you take Formula One and put it into that world, football would now be 3 goals per side, 6 footballs, twice the number of players. We'd be doing 160 games. We'd be doing 160 games a season. They just change. And the minute that someone like me who doesn't really watch football has a comment saying, "Oh, that was a boring 0-0," they'd think, "Oh well, we'll chuck another ball in, or we'll give them another goal, and that'll mean each match will be like a rugby score." And that's not what it should be.
It's a bit like F1's got an identity crisis, isn't it?
Yeah. What it should be doing is thinking, okay, well, we need to be more environmentally friendly, sustainable, diverse. I get all of that, and the diversity is a fantastic thing, but that could have worked in the old V10 era. So we can't be connecting stuff like diversity and sustainability versus what actual car races on the track, because what we should be doing is thinking, well, the real Formula One fans, what do they want to come and watch? I know the answer to that. It's V10s. It's screaming at 19,000 RPM. It's looking at cars that you think, oh shit, I couldn't do that. And then we should just be offsetting the whole thing with environmental projects and everything else, because ultimately the reality is you go and watch, the cars look quick, they're not loud enough, and that takes out a huge amount.
It is a really interesting... I've never thought of it until you'd said that, is why are they manipulating the way that the sport is presented and what it's about based off the opinions of people that aren't interested in the sport?
But just on that point, they are interested, but they don't. Their opinions based on what? Nothing. It's based on what they've seen on that day. But then the reasons why, say for example, there wasn't much passing in one race. Yeah, but why not? What were the conditions like? What was the nature of the track? Were there any other? They've got to. All their opinions have to be based on facts. And I think that when you open up polls to, what was the best race of the year? What would you want to see next year in Formula One? I think a few years back, they actually had a spectator survey or fan survey of what they'd want to see. And you end up with what you end up with is DRS.
Don't get us started on DRS.
Because they'll put all those survey questions together and they'll make a PowerPoint presentation and sit down in front of the board in Formula One and said, well, we've asked the fans and they want to see more overtaking.
Well, yeah. Well, this is a
we'll give them a wing that makes just a car.
This is a big thing, a big talking point for us. And with DRS, we've been pretty vocal that we don't like it. But would you rather have? I think they look at DRS as, well, we just want pure statistics. Were there more overtakes this season? Yes. Doesn't matter whether they were good. You can't defend DRS nowadays. It's a push to pass. And so what is the point? I would much rather have a race where you have fewer overtakes and more on-track battling than somebody that just sits and waits to be overtaken by a car in DRS. I just don't see I don't get any enjoyment from that. I don't, because you can't defend. As soon as he gets within a second, he's gone past.
I would say that's what comes down to, like James said, the Netflix generation. I think that's kind of where that started from, is that the passing point and not the actual true battling is coming because snowflakes who don't really have a great opinion on the sport come in and just say it anyway. Because regardless of what we put out here today on this podcast, there's always going to be one guy that's going to say, I hope that Brad guy falls down the stairs in 5 minutes, for no reason. They're voicing that toxic trait. They're voicing something. They've got a platform to say it, and you see all these people like at Silverstone where someone came onto the track and people were coming onto the track to voice the fact they weren't happy with the environmental changes and things like that. That can't be happening. I think that's the reason the sport has to take these precautions. It can't deal with the fallback of potentially killing someone on track.
But I think if it's about overtaking, sorry, I'm not buying that, because if I was to take anyone that complained about Formula One that there's not enough overtaking, and I took them to Monaco and stood them on the inside of Tabac or the inside of Casino Square and said, I tell you what, tell me that that's not interesting enough. There's hardly any overtaking at Monaco. But even with the quiet cars that we've got today, they'd literally stand there and think, "Holy shit,
Yeah,
that's
but
impressive."
it's like the safest way of causing something dangerous without.
But
having
that's
it
with
as
no
dangerous.
overtaking. It's
Yeah,
impressive.
exactly.
So it's not an overtaking issue. I think it's the spectacle of how the cars make you feel when you watch it. And I used to stand, as many people did, on the bank at Silverstone on a wet Tuesday when I'd gone to Grand Prix Raceway to get some new kit, and I'd hear a Formula One car fire up.
Yeah.
And I'd be, oh my God. And I'd literally drive my car, sneak in through the gate, go and stand on the bank at Woodcote, and I could hear it. And it'd be a, Frentzen and an Arrows or whatever.
Yeah.
And the minute it fired up in the pit lane, 2.5 mile away, the hairs on the back of your neck stood up. And you thought, oh my God, this is the most incredible thing. And you look at, through Instagram, I follow a couple of guys. There's actually a guy who I followed that he's basically documented his entire experience of motorsport from when he was a kid, and now he's got his kids. He's got video of them enjoying it, and so it's amazing. But he posts these pictures of like stood on the outside of Luffield or Copse, watching Schumacher and Hakkinen and Montoya going through in like 03 or whatever, and it just makes you realise that those cars were absolute monsters. But they're slower than what we're doing now.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter.
The lap time's irrelevant.
Yeah,
it's
it is.
how the car makes you feel. In the same way, when you go to a Champions League match under the lights and they play the music, and you think, whether you're a football fan or not, you're thinking, "Fuck, I'm having some of this."
Well, that is why people go to football matches. The view is worse. It's much better to watch it on the TV, but you still want to go for the atmosphere. And I think it's true to be said, not just about Formula One, but driving in general.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting to an emotionless state. Mm-hmm. Self-driving, electric cars. It's just purely a means of transport, which worries me because, like you said, the sport really should be based on the emotional factor, and that is something that they don't take into account. It's just what are the statistics? Are we doing better? It's a business, are we making more money? Are we getting more overtakes?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, we've seen those demonstration runs with Vettel with this biofuel that supposedly, I don't know how it works, but it doesn't emit anywhere near the same amount of chemicals or harmful chemicals into the environment. Yet he was driving around in a V10 from the 90s.
But the issue with that was, and I was physically there all 3 days, I had guests that had not been to a Grand Prix before. And they were more blown away by that than the thing they'd come to watch.
Yeah.
Now that's wrong. That is not. If you went to the Super Bowl and you were more impressed by the halftime show than the actual match, then you got a problem.
Yeah.
And I think, and the the NFL would have a big problem.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't seem to listen to the. I don't think we listen I don't think Formula One listen to the important voices. They listen to the loudest shouting ones.
I think,
sadly, with social media, the loudest shouting ones.
It's this woke culture, isn't it? It's trying to be
a new group of. And don't get me wrong, it's fantastic that they're into the sport, but they don't know what they're missing.
Yeah.
If they were literally time traveled back 20 years to watch what they could have had, they'd be thinking, "Oh, I'll tell you what, screw that. We'll have a bit more of that, please." And it's people like myself, yourself, and the people that have been at Grand Prix probably since the 60s that are still alive, that they're banging a drum that they just know, oh, yeah, but I can't compete with all this new lot that are going to basically asking for, a different format. So they want a sprint race instead of a V10.
Yeah,
that's what you're up against.
Yeah, and I just. I worry that there's no way out of it now because we've gone so far down the garden path that, like I said, Formula One is trying to be as politically correct to as many people as possible. And so they're having to incorporate, the environmentally friendly measures, get to a point where we won't be able to have combustion engines. I just think for the time being, whilst they're still legal, because they won't be eventually.
Exactly. I think
why not enjoy it whilst we can?
We shouldn't be frightened of especially when you have the ability, organizations like where I work now, we have ESG programs, which we literally think about the culture, the well-being, which Formula One is doing now, the diversity of employees, but also this concept of offsetting your environmental impact,
Yeah.
because you go about doing business. We don't change how we do business, but we have the ability to offset against what we do. So is there not a way that surely, as you just said, we could be in an era where we know that potentially there are more efficient ways of doing it, but the show is the more important thing? And they then have the ability through a huge number of other programs to offset the impact of the ideal Formula One, whether it's a V10 or a V8, or V12, that doesn't matter. But if you've got a concept, you think, right, this is what racing's about. This is technology. This is pushing the limits. This is the most frightening beast of a car that you could ever stand at the side of a track and watch. That's what we should be doing.
Yeah. Because if you think about it, the argument that Formula One should be the cutting edge of technology that progresses, road transportation, it's not anymore. That's Formula E. It has to be Formula E because transport for the general population will be going electric, and there's no two ways about it. And so Formula E has gone down that road, and that's the route for them to take. And so I think Formula One has to look at, well, they either have to go fully electric and they commit to that, and that's it, if they want to be weird contributing to road technology, or they need to go with the most emotive racing series, the pinnacle of emotive racing series. I think it's an interesting point. I'd be interested to know what our listeners would have to say about it, because a lot of people have only recently got into Formula One, and I don't know what the percentage of our listeners are that have been watching it for more than 4 or 5 years, but they've never had that experience. And I don't know whether Formula One will start to lose that, because yes, a lot of people came in because of Netflix, and they stayed for a little bit because we had that ridiculous 2021 season. But unless that type of drama continues, which they're obviously trying to manufacture with all these, sprint races and things, the core fans are going to jump ship to something different. I don't know what that might be.
Yeah, but I think you're completely right, because if you look at MotoGP, so I don't race bikes. I never have. I've been to a MotoGP race 3 times, maybe. And I went as a rookie, not knowing what to expect, and was blown away by it. MotoGP has had nowhere near the number of regulation changes over the last 20 years. Obviously, it's evolved with technology, but they've not jumped all over it and said, right, well, this racing's not working. Let's do something else. Let's change the format. At some point, you have to just let the racing be itself.
Yeah.
And obviously, the nature of Formula One, it's harder to overtake than on a MotoGP bike. Of course it is, because the downforce and the brakes are so good, so the braking distances are so small. So there could have been so many little things we could have done to Formula One in 2010, 2009, that could have helped the racing, made it more exciting, but not change the core essence of the sport. So, for example, make the brakes less efficient. So you make the braking distances bigger so people can actually outbrake people. And you take the power steering off. So drivers make mistakes. So the exits so the exits are bad, and the overtaking happens. When the drivers get tired, like they used to back in the day, they make mistakes.
Yeah.
Turbo lag would be a good one. Yeah,
exactly. All those things. Yeah. That doesn't mean you've got to make it quiet and boring.
Yeah.
And falsify it all with DRS.
Yeah.
You've got to think about what it is that's stopping the racing being, as technology has evolved. Well, you can look at what's got, you can look at the racing the brake distances from the 60s to 2010 and think they've literally been cut to literally 10% probably of what they were.
Yeah.
And you can dial it back, and you can limit, the materials that are used, but it's not falsifying it and changing the essence of it. It's tweaks. Whereas I think when you have a point that every 5 years or 4 years you have a massive regulation change, it's like, oh, you're starting from scratch every time.
Yeah, well, they've got no reason to go backwards now either, because if we go back to spectatorship again, I think MotoGP and stuff like that will never really change, because it's the way it is. It's just a pure racing form. And even
that's what Formula One was. That's
exactly
the thing.
But
it was
we
purely
get
about that.
We will never get that back.
And I think with Formula E versus Formula One, within bikes, let's look at that. You've got World Superbikes and MotoGP.
Yeah.
MotoGP is the equivalent of Formula One. It's all, built from the ground up. World Superbike, you can go and buy that in a shop.
They're pretty loud as well. I think
But they're only,
well,
5-6 seconds slower, something
Yeah.
like that. And you go and watch the World Superbike guys, and that blows you away. And that was bought, you could literally go into a dealership and buy the chassis that bike is. And obviously you've got race parts that go on it. And that's the concept of that championship.
Yeah.
So what is the concept of Formula One? It used to be the pinnacle of technology, screaming engines, drivers that you thought were heroes because they couldn't do what... Even I watched Formula One when I first started racing, thinking, how the hell am I meant to do that? I'm not going to be able to do that. What am I talking about?
Yeah, it's a shame.
Whereas now, and I've been out of a car for a single-seater car since over 10 years now.
Yeah.
But I don't want to sound like an idiot, but if you gave me a day in a Formula One car, I'm not going to be quickest, but I'd be within 4 or 5 seconds. Probably.
Yeah, races would be. I think you've done it before. So,
but if I jump now in a 2002 Williams, no chance.
Yeah,
no chance.
The only aspect now really is your physical,
exactly.
your core of being able to drive.
Now, I have these conversations all the time, and from ex-drivers and people I'm still friends with and stuff, and you genuinely think I could probably jump in and do an okay job. A bit of time on the sim, a couple of days, I'd be close enough to think I did all right. Whereas, I had a ex-teammate of mine, Marco Asma, in Formula 3 and Formula Ford. And I remember in 2003, in Formula Ford, he was managed by a guy called Harold Heinzman, who used to manage Raikkonen, I think, originally. And he used to do some straight line, a bit of testing for Formula 1. In 2003, he was going from Formula Ford, and he did a test at Barcelona in a Williams in 2003.
What the hell?
And he just said it literally blew his mind. And and he went on to do various stuff with BMW and so, and he was very, very, very quick.
Even the weight of the car is
incredible.
So much more now.
He was really, really good, Marco. Yeah. Really nice guy. And I just remember thinking, that doesn't make sense. But even 20 years later, I look back and think it's almost like we've got two different types of Formula One. I look at that era of Formula One as a different sport.
Yeah.
Which is mad when you think it shouldn't be like that.
So what do you believe should be Formula One's current identity? I mean, what
I think keep it very simple. I think we've confused the whole thing because like I say, the identity is kind of depending on who they listen to last. I think that I think actually Martin Brundle says similar thing. I think you should have core elements of the cars should be mass produced. So the brakes should all be same for all teams. You could have generic aero packages. All of these things are various purposes for it. It equalizes it.
Yeah.
So you don't get the manufactured very quick guys to the slower teams. More back to a one-make series. But it's also cheaper. So it's now still approaching that kind of money aspect. But the core element to it has to be more of a kind of like a raw mechanical driver dictated car. Whereas now, because they're relatively so easy to drive and they're on rails, those drivers are more than ever now getting the absolute limit out of those cars.
Yeah.
Whereas in 1902 to 2007, those cars were, if they were set up perfectly, you do the perfect lap. But they were sideways, ragged, on the ragged edge. And you could see the drivers working away. And you just don't see that now. So I think what Formula One should be is there's elements of making it more affordable. There's elements of making the cars more similar, so the racing is closer. But it needs to get back to having an atmosphere that just gets your spine tingling.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very hard one to put that's a very generic phrase to say, it needs to have that special something.
The intangible.
Yeah, but I think that when you've had it, then you can get it back.
Yeah.
It's not like we're trying to achieve something that's never been achieved. We had a Formula One that made fans just in awe of the sound and the speed and the aggressive essence of motorsport.
Mm.
And I think now that we've just softened everything off and made it quieter, and yes, obviously the technology is impressive with how more efficient the cars are, but
It's almost too impressive.
is that what it needed? I don't think it was. I think that if we had our current flock of young drivers in massive monster V10 creatures around some of the circuits that we now have, the Bakus and the Singapores, Jesus Christ, that would be worth watching.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, for anybody that's not seen it, anybody that's listening that's not seen the onboard of Senna and that McLaren MP4 was just
But even when you look back into later than that, to the late 90s, there's random. I think they went to like a narrow track car and a groove tire in 98 maybe 98. And you look at like the Villeneuve Williams of those days, you think, Jesus Christ, how did he do that for 67 laps?
Yeah.
And that's what it should be.
Yeah.
I've been lucky enough to drive some incredible cars, but the ones that sponsors of mine and fans that came to watch, and the ones that stick out for them were those, like we talked about before, the Super League, V12.
Yeah.
Most people won't have ever heard of that championship, but just Google it, and those cars were absolute beasts. From a driver, they were physical, they were hard to set up. You didn't know what you were doing with it one corner from the next, depending on what mood it was in. That was what you needed.
Bring back the Super League.
Well, there you go. I mean, Champ Car. But
this is James angling to get back into get back into the car.
It basically was a Champ Car, basically, from the late 90s.
Yeah.
And if you look back, and America, again, it's frustrating that look at IndyCar now and Champ Car going back. It's a more raw, driver-dictated car. And you can see the thing jumping around, literally trying to put the driver in the wall, especially those street tracks they do. Whereas now the cars in Formula One are so finely tuned and so dependent on aero rather than the mechanical element of the car that somewhere like, I've never been to Baku, but that for a street track, that's fucking quick.
Yeah.
And it doesn't come across like it's as much of a risk as I'm sure it is. Those drivers, don't get me wrong with, the rant I'm having, those drivers are absolutely on the limit. And from inside the car, they'll be thinking, Jesus, in qualifying, I don't want to do that lap again.
Yeah.
That'll be absolutely terrifying. But from the outside,
it's like the elevator music, isn't it? When
it doesn't look like that.
It's serene.
And that, when we talk about essence, we need to get back to a point where if you took even someone that's watched it before, or a complete novice to Formula One, like I did with MotoGP, and I took sponsors and I stood them at the side of a track and a MotoGP bike came past, and they literally leant back and went, "Holy shit!"
Yeah,
and he didn't want to stand there again. And that says it all.
Yeah,
that's where we should be.
I mean, you even get a little bit of that. I mean, when we went to Alton Park, earlier in the year, just in the GT Championship, it's
because you can see the drivers working, you can see the cars moving around, and I think that when you've got a position where people at home are thinking, let's see what happens. That's not.
Yeah,
that's not where you want.
We're going to struggle to get back there. But the only thing I think we can really advocate for in the last 10 so years is it's not even been that long. The Halo coming in.
Mm-hmm.
If you had that Halo on older generation cars, we would have had the best racing of all time. But even now, we've probably, if like you say, you've put those drivers into older cars. If they made the same mistakes they made this year, they'd all be dead.
Yeah,
because like Mick Schumacher, when he hit the wall at Saudi, probably would have died in an older car.
Yeah,
Guan Yu Zhou at Silverstone.
Yeah,
terrible incident.
And but that's the thing though. You even see it now when you've got drivers going to Goodwood and doing demonstration runs. And I think did I see a video recently? I think Hamilton was being interviewed at Abu Dhabi. Was it last year or the year before when Alonso was doing that Renault? He was driving his own, his old Dhabi World Championship winning car.
Yeah,
and Hamilton was talking and he just stopped.
Yeah,
he was like, "Oh,
we all make the same face, don't you? Hear it, and everyone goes,
so good." And if the drivers are thinking it, imagine what we're thinking.
He didn't even get to properly drive.
Imagine what we're thinking at home if the drivers are thinking, "Oh,
Yeah.
How come I'm not driving that anymore?
Yeah.
You know?
I'd do anything to go back.
But I think we'll see what happens. But I think in terms of the growth of the sport, I mean, it's impressive. When you've got you've got tracks that are coming up this year, Vegas, Miami, etc. I think the Miami thing was interesting. I think the idea was great. Was it the most interesting circuit or race? Probably not. Should you be having Grand Prix at Paul Ricard when you've got Manicourt sat there? I don't know. Manicourt, obviously, it'll be a money issue that it lost the Grand Prix back in the day.
Yeah.
And it was always known at the time, you probably won't remember, Manicourt was known at the time for being the boring Grand Prix of the year because there was never much overtaking. But if you took Formula One back there now, and again, this contradicts a little bit to what we've just been talking about. If you took the current regulations where we're talking about DRS, cars that can follow quicker, etc., 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 back to Manicourt, you get a hell of a better race there than you are at Paul Ricard.
Yeah, it'd be amazing.
So there has to be an element of adaptation, but I think that at some point, as we say, I think the Netflix generation and younger guys are going to dictate where we go with the sport.
Yeah,
and I think that
and that's so hard.
The older generation just have to accept it.
Yeah, I think we're already at that point. In my opinion, we have to accept that. And if you want to witness something special, then go to Goodwood or something like that, where you can experience these cars properly on rails going up the Goodwood track, and that's kind of just a demonstration of what it was like. I mean, anyone listening to this I'd imagine majority of the people listening to this are the Netflix generation now. I mean, majority of our listeners are actually in the US,
right?
And that's kind of a weird thing. It's I don't think previously it was really a big thing in the US, and that's only recent. That's become huge.
Yeah.
I don't even know where we go.
Yeah, I think the US was a hard one for a while for Formula One. I think now that we've got that commitment from the circuits, I think that, and obviously with Hamilton, a lot of the drivers living in the US, Hamilton being big over there, I think it will continue. Obviously, the debacle of the Indianapolis Grand Prix when you had 6 cars on the grid kind of screwed the whole job, really. But you think, when was that? I'm going to guess at a date, about 2005 or something stupid like that. 7 maybe. But look how long it's taken to get back to being consistently in the US. It's crazy.
Yeah, so we have digressed a little bit.
That's all right.
But jumping back into this season just gone, I'd be interested to know from both of you, who have you been obviously besides the championship winner, who have been your standout drivers of the season?
I think one of the most interesting players, sometimes controversial players, but important players, was Perez. I think that having, Max has never had a teammate that's been quite as close, I don't think, which has been interesting. I think that Perez's experience helped drive that team forward. I think it was probably underestimated how big a part he played in the team's success. Obviously, the rivalry with Leclerc and that going right down to the line was a really good thing to watch play out. And I think that he deserved that seat, actually. He's had a couple of lesser teams, smaller teams, whatever you want to call them, but he'd finally got himself into what you could call a factory team.
Yeah. And
he delivered. I think he did really well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'd probably agree with you on that. But I'm still going to go with Russell on this year, just because I think he's had the challenge of coming into a team where he's against probably one of the best drivers you've ever seen. And he's outperformed him through a year of Formula One, which is not an easy feat, especially it's Lewis Hamilton, man. And I think George has done a great job, and I think he's proven that he should be in that team and that he's got a really good future ahead of him.
Yeah.
So yeah, for similar reasons, where I think George will give Lewis a harder time than what Valtteri did, because now Lewis knows that he can be outperformed. And I think that's the same reason you say with Perez, but the issue is Max is perfect in nearly every way right now. Even I don't even want to think about Max too much, because I think he's just too good right now, and I reckon he's going to do it again next year. But I'm going to go George. But what will you, Tom?
Standout driver, I think. I mean, it's a tricky one because of it's been dominated by Red Bull, and it's difficult to kind of assess a lot of people because they don't get a lot of TV coverage, which is another griping point, especially when Max is so far out in the lead. But I'd have to agree with you. I think with George, I think you have to look at where Hamilton was when he came into Formula One. Competing straight away with Alonso and fighting for a world championship with Ferrari and Raikkonen. And Russell has come in, and I know Hamilton has had difficulties with the car, but they've had the same car all season, and he's come out on top. And I think that's not an easy feat. I think that shows that punt that Toto had taken on George and taking him up from Williams to Mercedes, has worked. And so the only gripe I have with George was towards the latter part of the season. I felt like he did drop off a bit. I feel like he's not qualified as well as Hamilton, and that was one of the questions actually that I wanted to pose to you, James. And we've spoken briefly about this in the past on previous podcasts, but it's something that has come up again. So let me just find the tweet. It was to do with pace and performance of good and great drivers. But how difficult is it to extract 100% of the performance of a car as opposed to just 95% of the performance of a car? I mean, what?
So yeah, it's a good question. So I think we briefly touched on it before that the quicker cars at the front of the grid are easier to drive than the slower ones, which people will stand and think, well, hang on a minute, you're going quicker. So how's that easier to do? So how well a car is set up will ultimately dictate how much of its true potential you can actually drag out of it.
Yeah,
I think, and that boils down to driver feel. It comes down to driver intelligence, which I think Russell is very, very good at. I think he's a very intelligent kid. But it also comes down to experience. So when you've got a driver that has no experience but can still do it, by default, it means he's naturally talented and he's very intelligent. So the drivers and the laps that are on pole, it's never 100%. There's no such thing as the perfect lap ever.
Yeah.
But you do see people every now and again that get very, very, very close to it. So I think that the crazy thing for people to get a head around is actually the way that motorsport works is you may get a driver like Gasly, for example, who last year, not so much this year, last year was best of the rest, the majority of places we went.
Yeah.
He will probably have driven, as a percentage of his own ability and car ability, a better lap to put that car sixth than Sainz in a Ferrari to be third or second.
Yeah.
But it's just because the limit of that car
is lower.
Is lower. It is what it is. So I think it's something that's hard to explain what qualifying, because it's a skill that some drivers have. I always struggled in qualifying, but was far, far stronger in over a race distance. I could look after tyres better. I would have a setup that traditionally would, if it suited my driver style, wouldn't be quite as pointy as some drivers. That hurt me in qualifying, but helped me over an hour and a half.
Right.
So that is also a factor of qualifying, that you've got to think, okay, well, yes, a certain team may have had less poles during a season. I think Ferrari were probably better in qualifying this year than Red Bull, or if not, it was very close.
They were definitely were at the beginning of the season.
That's also a factor. So there's so many things when it comes to getting the most out of the car. But I think a lot of it with qualifying is confidence. Like you've always had, Senna was a classic example of qualifying. It was just it was like the Senna hour, wasn't it? Formula One.
Yeah.
Drivers were literally jumping out of his way to make sure that they didn't get in his way. And I think that when you've got drivers that are uber confident, love the pressure of qualifying, Hamilton has always been a good qualifier.
Yeah.
Vettel was always a good qualifier at Red Bull, certainly. It really does make the good drivers stand out. It really does.
So would you say, I mean, on the face of it, you would think qualifying is the out and out performance factor
Mhm.
of a driver, isn't it? You
Yeah.
know, you can be a great racer, but it's almost a completely different skill set
Mhm.
to being quick.
Yeah.
So is it a case that the quickest qualifier is the quickest driver, yet whoever wins a championship is the most skillful racer?
Yeah, good question. So I think you'd say, in my opinion, now, because of how much relatively easier the cars are to drive, even though they're quicker and they've got more power, they're easier to drive than a 95 or a 94 Williams, for example.
Yeah.
Whoever's on pole has the best overall package of driver, aero, mechanical setup, team. You know, when they put them out in the session, is it the right ambient temperature? Are they waiting for a bit of cloud cover? You know, all those little, everything together
Yeah.
is what you've got. But now the driver that wins the race, I'd say, is probably more intelligent
Yeah.
than ever before, than anyone else.
Yeah.
Whereas 20 years ago, the driver that won the race was probably the fastest driver, because over 75 laps, he was on the limit. He was doing a quali lap. You know, Schumacher says a number of times he was doing a quali lap every lap.
Yeah.
Every lap it was a quali lap. Whereas now, you know, the drivers are 6, anywhere between 6 and 10 seconds slower at the beginning of the Grand Prix because of fuel and all that sort of stuff than they were at the beginning of the race. And they're looking after the tyres from lap 1.
Yeah.
That takes intelligence. So I think now you've got the best package of overall team and driver is on pole,
Mm-hmm.
and the most intelligent driver it wins the race.
So it's interesting what you say about a qualifying lap every lap. And this is another question that leads me on to it slightly different. But in Mexico, Verstappen, we saw this statistic and we discussed this on the podcast. It was, I think, for 40 out of the 60 laps, he was within 0.3 of a second of his previous lap.
Mm-hmm.
Every single lap.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what type of is it? Is that skill, concentration, like driving to the millimeter?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's everything really. So it's funny when you say that. My first instinct is 0.3 is actually quite a lot. So it sounds mad. So through Formula Ford, Formula 3, World Series, you know, the lower Formula Championships I did, because the drop off in the tyres wasn't there, you would quite consistent, if you went out in testing, for example, and you were going to do a 15 lap run,
mm-hmm.
you could probably do every lap within a tenth.
That's insane.
God.
A tenth and a half. Certainly if you were jumping 0.3 quicker, 0.3 slower, then you got a problem.
Yeah.
And it's, when you think a tenth is basically that, or it's a tenth at full speed is about a car length. A tenth is the best way of thinking about it. So a second is about 10 car lengths, is the way to picture a tenth.
Yeah.
So if you were doing every lap and you always came round within a car length of yourself. So if you think on, you know, when people at home listening play PlayStation and they've got their ghost car.
Yeah.
If you did every lap and the ghost cars were always overlapping at the end of every lap, you'd think, Jesus, that's hard. Whereas normally when your ghost lap it's either down the road or it's in the wall or it's, you know, second and a half behind. But you're doing every lap within that much.
Yeah.
And you think about how many variables there are. And you also think that if you go into a hairpin, for example, or in, you know, the first corner at Monza, if you were to brake a car length later, you'd gain a couple of tenths. Or if you jumped on the throttle half a car length earlier and you got to full throttle 2 meters earlier, you'd gain 0.3 down the next straight. So tiny changes gain you huge amounts of time.
Yeah.
But you still lap every single lap within a tenth of each other. And I think when you take that out of Formula One and you go to Le Mans, again, the way the cars are developed now and the tyre technology is insane at Le Mans. A 24-hour race, every lap of a 24-hour race is a qualifying lap.
Yeah.
The fastest lap in the race in the middle of the night is faster than qualifying. It's faster than pole. It's just it's relentless. And that, when we go just quickly going back to what we were talking about before, what is Formula One? For me, Formula One is not looking after tyres. Formula One is 2 or 3 pit stops. Every lap's a quality lap. The drivers are knackered the minute they get out of the car. And it is literally on the limit from the minute the lights go out until the minute the checkered flag.
Otherwise, it would be called Formula One Endurance Championship.
Exactly. Yeah, it shouldn't, which is what it is now.
Yeah.
But going back, yeah, the consistency of a driver is ultimately what gets him in the car. And you hear quite a few championships, and they used to do it in Formula One. So, for example, Button in 2000 literally went for a test against Bruno Junqueira, who was a Brazilian IndyCar driver at the time, who was also under contract for testing, I think, at Williams. And they had a test off at Barcelona. And it was literally, you've got one day in the car. Jensen, you're going to do the morning. You'll have 3 sets of tyres. Bruno, you're going to do the afternoon. You'll have 3 sets of tyres. Fastest wins. And we'll have a meeting. You guys all go home. All the engineers will have a meeting with Frank on Monday morning. And we're going to decide who we're going to give it to. That is it.
Yeah.
And that would not come down to ultimate lap time. It would not be who was fastest, because the wind changes direction. It would have been cooler in the morning for happy hour. All the various stuff that they've all seen 1,000 times. It would have come down to, right, irrespective of what time of day it was, we gave him 10 laps of fuel and a new set of tyres, and his times differentiated on average a tenth a lap. We gave Bruno them. He did a quicker lap time, but his next lap was 4/10 slower. Then he went 3/10 quicker, and then he nearly went off, and then he outbraked himself. No. Jensen would have been bang, 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 bang every lap.
Yeah.
And that's what it would have given it to him. So its consistency is probably up there with the importance of fitness, concentration, raw skill. Consistency. Without consistency, forget it.
Interesting. Well, that actually leads me on, fitness-wise, because this was another question. And yeah, go on. You can read this one out.
Oh, okay, it's gone. I'm going to have to get it back again. I know what the question is roughly. I think it was someone called Exo Shaman had sent in a question. He said, "Are your body parts insured as a racer?"
They can be for the guys in Formula One. It wouldn't surprise me if they were. I think the insurance thing's funny because all the way through the junior formula, you can take out insurance on the race cars and have special companies that do race car insurance. But in terms of medical insurance, it was quite a challenge. You always had to sometimes keep secret what you were doing.
It costs too much anyway.
Because I lucky I don't have to touch wood because I'm not doing it anymore. But I went through my career. I had some big plane crashes of shunts and walked away. Very fortunate. And obviously there's drivers that aren't as lucky, and obviously we see drivers that are sadly killed. But I think it's one of those areas, to answer his question, that I never really thought about. What do I do if you were that focused on winning and being in the car the next time and going testing and being fit and all that stuff? That was more for the management to sort out, for making sure that all the fundamentals were covered. Because if you started thinking about stuff like that, if you actually thought about what you were doing, you wouldn't do it.
Yeah, one of relating to that, don't forget to read out who'd sent that question through in a second. But one thing that relates to that is, I can't believe it when they're not racing. We see like Lewis Hamilton on a motorbike. You'd think Toto's going, no.
No. There are clauses. So funny enough.
Yeah.
So funny enough, that is in. I had contracts that were, you weren't allowed to do various things. You couldn't go skiing, even though I did. You just keep it quiet. This was pre-social media, so no one knew where you were doing. You keep stuff a secret. But a large number, like the majority of professional sports, you can't just go motocrossing and go and do the Dakar, stuff like that drivers now are allowed to do. That was never allowed. I think back to, I hope it's a public story now. He won't mind me telling it. Derek Warwick, who's a friend of mine who lives locally here in Jersey, obviously Formula One, 80s, early 90s, missed a Grand Prix or two, I believe, because he broke his arm. I want to say it was arm doing the Jersey Hill climb in a go-kart. He crossed the line. he crossed the line and he went underneath the ambulance or a road car that was parked after the finish line and broke his arm.
And he was a
Completely
current Formula One racer.
out of contract. Yeah, I think he was heavily fined and all sorts of stuff. But those days, like, you weren't allowed to do anything if it could endanger your full-time program. I mean, now, if you had anything about you, you'd obviously make sure you didn't ever hurt yourself. And funny enough, you don't see that many occasions with people like Verstappen, Leclerc, Sainz doing stuff that's too crazy. But you do get the odd occasion where off-season, more so off-season than during the season, that Hamilton will go and test. Was it Rossi's MotoGP bike?
Yeah, they do
did
like
a bit of a
stunt
car
videos.
switch and stuff. So
Yeah.
there is more of it, but I think that I think Montoya. I think there's also something's jumping out. Montoya was doing something, and he got. I think he claimed that he was playing tennis, but in reality, he wasn't even playing tennis. He never played tennis in his life. And again, when Schumacher broke his leg at Silverstone in '99, obviously Irvine then took over the mantle at Ferrari and was potentially going to win Ferrari's first world championship. Think of all the hard work that Schumacher had done.
Yeah.
And potentially Irvine was going to be the person that won their first championship, and
Crazy.
Schumacher wasn't having any of it. So he'd sadly had that accident at Silverstone and broken his leg mid-year, and was telling the team, I can't come back and help him, play number 2 role to Eddie for the last 2 races. I'm too badly injured. And there's a picture of him playing tennis on a broken leg. So they're like, right, you get your ass back to Malaysia and you're in it. And he had to come back, but he was trying his best not to come back.
That's so crazy.
So there's various stuff off track that they get up to, but the clever guys keep it a secret.
No, fair enough. That's a really good question. It was XO Shaman who sent that one. So thank you so much for that. We actually had another question. This one actually, funny enough, is a question that my colleague Georgie asked. Just says, what is your personal diet like when you were racing, and like your regime compared to what it would be like now?
Yeah, so diet-wise, I've always been quite fortunate in the fact that I've always had a very high metabolism, so I could eat pretty much anything and burn it off. In the day, we were obviously doing a lot of training. So from kind of 2006, when I was doing Formula 3, all the way through to 2013, 14, when I stopped doing WEC and everything in between, I had a full-time trainer, Stuart Wilde at Formula Fitness, was actually based in Oxford, where I was based. So I would literally see him, 3 or 4 hours in the morning at the Oxford University campus, Iffley Road, which was actually where Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. That track there in Oxford. And again, you'd be in good company. You'd have the Oxford Blue Boat there, guys would be training. You'd have the Oxford rugby team training. So you were in a real hive of athletics and sport and professional sport. But yeah, so I'd be training pretty much 6 hours a day, 5-6 hours a day, sessions in the morning, sessions in the afternoon. He'd have my full program. We'd obviously balance that between strength work, conditioning work. 2 or 3 days before being in a car, it would be more agility and core work. So you'd never be risking lifting heavy weights 2-3 days before getting in a car in case you hurt yourself. And then the main work for me was really over the Grand Prix weekend. So I've got various food allergies which do my head in and always will do. But my main priority is that you arrive at a race weekend and your body doesn't know that you're doing something different. It just, you need, like we talk about, banging that drum, being consistent. It's routine. It's not crazy foods that you've never eaten before. It's boring stuff. It's the right amount of fuel, the right type of fuel that you need, both in the morning, snacking a little bit in the morning so you're not got a heavy stomach before qualifying, making sure you're not eating big, especially testing as well. Don't have a huge lunch even though you're starving, because all you want to do in the afternoon is fall asleep. You feel lethargic on a full stomach and you're just not quick. So you've got to be quite clever with it like that. But in terms of actual diet, I think it was a case of, for me, because of my metabolism, I didn't necessarily have a crazy diet anyway. I wouldn't be picking out on stuff, but it was mainly for me a little bit of something in the morning. So I've not got an empty stomach, but really just fueling your body through the weekend with the right, with everything it needs to perform. And especially with the shorter races, single seaters, the races were relatively short. You'd be doing anywhere from a 30-minute to 25-minute Formula 3 race to a 45, 50-minute World Series race. So it wasn't massively challenging. But actually, when you get to sports cars and you're doing, quadruple stints at Le Mans, which is 4 hours basically in a 60-degree car, it's hard. It's hard. So it's a real fine balance of nutrition, hydration, mental approach, and control of what your body can do, and listening to your body.
Would you have to map that all out? So you'd have to do that yourself, or did you have a dietitian?
Yeah, so my trainer Stuart would kind of take that. One of the reasons he would almost babysit me on a race weekend. So we would literally, and we got into a great routine. I mean, my most successful years, we had the routine absolutely dialed. So because he was based in Oxford as well, he'd travel with me on the Tuesday or Wednesday. We'd always share the flight, share a hire car, we'd share a room. We'd get into the same routine every night. So he would do, so even in the mornings, he'd get up. We even had the same routine in the morning. So he'd get up first, he'd have a shower, he'd go down and get breakfast. Whilst I was in the shower, he'd bring some food back up to the room. So I'd eat something quickly in the room rather than sitting down in the restaurant. So all these little things mean that actually when you're performing well, you just think, right, don't change, don't reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
It worked, just keep going with it. And I'd also parallel with Stuart work with a sports psychologist, Anne Kalea in Oxford again. She came to the odd race, but again, she was more for originally when we talk about sports psychology, it's dealing with pressure. And my early career, I felt I had the skill, but I didn't have the results. And how do we extract the performance in qualifying? All the stuff we've talked about.
Yeah.
But once I'd kind of established myself as a driver and had gone through the lower formula and was into, I think of 2009 when I was challenging to win the World Series Championship and winning races and stuff, it wasn't about that. It was about routine. I'd kind of accepted that the pressure is the pressure and you just know how to deal with it. And you've got the experience to deal with that now. But actually it was working and really dialing down into, okay, well, when you walk the track, what are you actually trying to achieve? Are you just walking it to say I've walked the track, right, off to the hotel? Or actually, are you taking pictures of it? Are you making maps? Are you going over the notes that you'd made for the last 2 years? Are you looking at the weather for the weekend? Are you doing it with your trainer? Are you doing it with your engineer? Is your team boss coming with you?
Yeah.
And actually, it's all well and good walking a track with your mates and showing them it. But what fucking use is that?
Yeah.
You need to have, especially if you've got a new engineer that you've not worked with before, you need to walk with the engineer and say, okay, so during the first session, when I say that I'm running wide and I'm taking too much curb at turn 3, this is the curb. This is what I'm talking about. When I say that the car is too stiff and I'm hitting the curb and it's pushing me too far over to the right for the next corner, take a picture of it. Yeah. You'll know what I mean. So when I say, can we soften the front a bit? Can we soften the rear to give a bit more traction? You need to understand what the world in which I'm in when I'm saying it. And that actually has a use. Whereas actually just, right, it says on my itinerary, I've got to walk the track before dinner. Right, I'll just cycle, it'll be quicker.
Yeah.
That doesn't achieve anything.
Yeah.
So it's having, and that is the job, really. People used to say, well, what's it like being a professional racing driver? Well, the answer is you're only in a car. When you think of a World Series Championship, you've got 10 rounds, so 10 weekends, 3 days. You're in the car 30 days a year. You didn't really do any testing.
Yeah.
30 days a year you're actually in a car, because you're not allowed to do, in those days you weren't allowed to do other championships as well. Right. So if you had a professional job but you only went into the office for a month of the year, but the other 11 months dictated how you performed on the month you went in, just think how important those 11 months would be. And you think back to also at the time when before I was ever paid to do it, when you were raising money to do it, you think, okay, well, those 30 days you spend, other than the fitness and all of that stuff and the approach and the mentality and the sports psychology and all that stuff, you've got to get yourself in the car. You've got to find the money to be able to pay for the sports psychologist, to pay for the trainer, to pay for the travel, to pay for the hotels, to pay for the damn. And, World Series, to do it properly was £1 million. 10 weekends, it's 100 grand a weekend.
Yeah.
Divided by 3, 33,000 quid a day. Every time in 2 sessions a day, it's 15 grand to do a practice session. And that is in itself something that people can't relate to. You think, hang on a minute, every time you get in the car to practice, so the equivalent of taking your kid to the driving range. So I took my son to the driving range this morning for an hour, hit 100 balls, cost me 12 quid. The equivalent of junior sport and teaching them how to do it, it costs tens of thousands of pounds every time you do it. So just think how prepared you need to be if you're about to spend 10 grand of your dad's money or a sponsor's money. Are you honestly going to turn up to that test session unprepared? No. But people do.
Yeah.
Kids now, because it's taken for granted, straight out of karting, we're going to go and do a Formula 3 test. Where? Oh, Jerez. 30 grand. Okay, well, what you've been training? You've been getting yourself ready? Oh, turned up late. My alarm didn't go off. Anyway, what's the plan? And it's like, God, guys, if you just understood how fortunate you are and the opportunity that you currently have, how much harder it would be. I know, of course, when you look back, when you're younger, you always think you could have worked harder and stuff. But I think one thing when I look back at my career is that from a certain point, and it was kind of 05, 06, my second year of Formula 3, which was only 2 years into my career at that point, because I started very late, I didn't know how to do anything else. I lived and breathed everything to do with racing. And I did not have a plan B, which is why, I probably got to where I did maybe, but I think it's, there's so much more to it than what people see on the TV. So to speak. And that's the same Formula One. Those guys work so hard to be able to turn up and go out in free practice one and, have an installation lap, and they'll stick 3 laps of fuel in it. New set of tyres, right? Give us a lap time on the board, bang.
Yeah, it's funny when you mentioned about like walking around the track and stuff. Like, obviously, they still do that now, and you see the videos of some drivers. Like I think I've seen Alonso like properly touch the track and feeling it and like knowing how he feels. They do the similar thing with esports. So they do a challenge every year, which they came out pretty recently. This is something completely random.
Yeah.
They blindfolded one of the best drivers, and he drove the lap, and it was nearly the same lap he puts out as a qualifying lap, which is just insane to think you can do that. Honestly,
it's funny because your body. So it's funny the car does it as well randomly. So the car based on, and I think this dates back to active suspension actually in Formula One. So based on the damping and the movement, the car knows where it is.
Could you do it? Do you reckon you could do it now?
Yeah, you probably could.
Blindfolded?
Yeah.
Fully.
I guess that's what it's like in the rain. If you said World Series car around Spa in the dry, I could probably do it
blindfolded.
within a second.
Within a second, blindfolded.
Yeah, what you mean, like
fully blind, blind
in your head, driving, in your head, obviously with the timing and the downshifts. And I saw a video of Perez doing it. He was stood on a stage in front of a screen, and they played his lap behind him, and you could physically.
And he knows where he is.
Absolutely, every shift in the right place, right time. Yeah, you can.
Your body remembers how perfect it is.
So obviously with an e-gaming, it's differently because you're not in the live environment. But it's muscle memory is an amazing thing, and I think that. If anything, I've learned to do now as an adult and as a father, other than driving blindfolded, is to listen to your body. It's a very difficult thing to do, and it's something that, in all seriousness, away from racing, when you're training to do anything, or if you have illnesses or whatever, you have to listen to what your body's telling you. It's a very clever tool, your brain and your body. And when stuff doesn't start feeling right, you've got to.
Yeah, so the reason I actually asked that question anyway is because I had something similar on my Facebook that came across. I can't remember who it was that sent me now, but they asked what it's like in the rain. So when you see Formula One now, they can't see anything pretty much. Is that basically like being completely blind?
You can't see anything.
It's just as simple as that. No. There you go. There's your answer. That's nice and easy one.
People go, come on, no, you can't.
Completely blind.
So I've been in, and all drivers have. It's not exclusive to anyone. You are when it's wet. Especially in single seaters when there's a large amount of downforce and it draws a lot of water off the circuit. You could be driving 6th gear or 4th, you're just going 5th, 6th, foot flat to the floor, and what are you waiting for? You could be going that way. For all you know.
That's when you're like muscle memory.
Yeah, you're listening to bumps in the tracks, other cars around you. It's not uncommon to actually be looking out the side of the car. But the reality is, enough of the track and enough about the car to roughly, and I don't care whether if Hamilton's telling me that he knows exactly. You don't know exactly. You know enough to do a good job of roughly where you are, and then you'll hit the brakes, and then it's only once you've hit the brakes for the first time, your skill, your ability kicks in, and you can suddenly see, because everyone else has slowed down, the spray goes just enough that you can see where you are, and then off the brake a bit, okay, and then you can make up the time you've lost, and that's the skill in the way. I was always, and maybe my lack of experience at the beginning of struggling with downforce, because it was such a crazy thing to think of at the time. But Formula Ford, when you didn't even have any downforce and it was just either grip or wheel spin, like on a bike, you either had grip or you didn't. And I had a feel with my right foot on the throttle to, even though it feels slow and like your granny pulling out of the supermarket, as long as you've got traction and as long as you're not locked up, you're effectively on the limit. And I always had an ability to listen to the tyre and feel what the tyre was doing. And it always looked slow. And I remember my manager, Tim Sugden, at the time saying, you don't really look like the car's alive very often, but you look at the stopwatch and it's fucking quick. And it just, I had an ability to, I didn't necessarily look like I was quick, but it would do the lap time.
That's what they said. Used to say on Top Gear, wasn't it?
Yeah, same thing. And even now you'll go, stand at the side of a Grand Prix track and in the wet, and as long as you've not got wheel spin, you'll do the lap time.
Yeah.
Whereas you'll have a Alonso or whoever that'll be sideways, and the thing will be on full lock, and it'll be all over, and it looks like, oh man, he's on it. But the cars just don't like being driven like that. And that's another thing. You got to listen to your body, but you've also got to listen to how each individual type of car wants to be driven a particular way.
Yeah.
And that takes experience as well. So, for example, you could put me in a Formula 3 car around Thruxton, which national motorsport fans will know is basically in Formula 3. It's the quickest racetrack in the country, in the UK. It's basically 2 chicanes and a load of corners, which are all easily flat in a Formula 3 car. So it's about just not scrubbing speed everywhere. And it's 2 braking areas basically. But I know I could go, and it's been 10, 12, 15 years since I did it, and I could do it straight away. You could put me in the Ferrari 458 at Paul Ricard or Silverstone, I could do it straight away. Because I know how those cars want to be driven. And I think that, taking it back to Formula 1, just goes to show how good rookies are. How quickly they figure out, and how quickly, now not necessarily figure out themselves, but all of the information they're given, because now they've got the data. They've got the engineers that can tell you, right, this is how you drive turn 1, this is how you drive turn 2, don't do this, don't do that, do this. And the intelligent ones, we talked about intelligence before, go, don't do that, don't do that. Right, okay.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah, because it's interesting. You say when it's wet, you're understanding. You're calling on your experience in the car. How it feels, the braking, all that type of stuff. But if you're a rookie, it's your first wet session in a race. They've got nothing to feed off because they don't know what it's like. So it's amazing that they get through it. I mean, sometimes you watch these wet races and you just think, no idea how they've done that.
Well, the crazy thing is with the wet races, like we saw, I think in Suzuka, is at the first lap of a wet race, the spread between the first, so when they come over the line at the end of the first race, first lap, the guy at the back can be a third of a lap down already because of spray. The guy at the front is literally he's on a qualifying lap.
Yeah.
Whilst he's going 200 mile an hour, at the top of Eau Rouge, down that straight, you'll have drivers in the middle or the back that are on half throttle in 4th gear, not knowing where the hell they are.
Yeah.
And they're not losing a tenth a corner, they're losing 4 or 5 seconds a corner for the first lap. So if you're 30 seconds behind after lap 1, well, your job done.
Yeah.
The day's finished.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the wet weekends are always fascinating for me. And I think on our last podcast, we talked about Suzuka, because I think it was just after Suzuka, and we talked about how people have performed. And I think I compared Vettel versus, I think it was Latifi. They came out of the pit lane together. And 20 minutes later, Vettel was 25, 30, something stupid, like 30 seconds in front of him. And it just shows experience, commitment in the wet, listening to the car, looking after the tyres, all of these things that, and that's the same across all motorsport. You know, I could literally list, if I wrote down, anywhere between 50 and 75 variables that a driver needs to think about at any one time when driving a racing car. Whereas if you take that to something like golf, is it 75? Probably not, but a golf swing is very technical and there's a lot to it, so it's probably 20 to 25.
Yeah.
Football is probably less again. Darts, snooker, you know, if you come all the way down, it's so simple.
Yeah.
It's literally you are banging the same drum, same muscle memory. So there's so much to motorsport that people don't think about or see. And it's all of that stuff bundled together that makes a driver the best, fifth best, worst, whatever. And some drivers, like all sports, some drivers never get it, and they have a go at it, and they think, oh. Like me, for example, I've at 39, I bought a motocross bike this year because there's a fantastic in Jersey, we've got a fantastic motorsport heritage of sand racing, motocross, hill climb, karting, everything. And I've always been into bikes, and I'm into road bikes as well, motorbikes and Triumphs and stuff. And I bought a motocross bike, and got a bit of private land that a friend of mine's got, and we've had a bit of a go on it, and 250cc motorbike. And I went to the motocross track, and it's literally like learning to walk again. And it's like, and I've genuinely thought that's good for fun and for training, because I know I like having stuff to train for, and I'll be able to do it. But in terms of racing it and being forget it. Like, not even, because I know what it takes to get from nowhere to better than anyone. And I know for a fact I wouldn't be able to do that. And that, sadly, is what motorsport differs from a lot of sports, is that you get some drivers, even that are very quick in karting, go into car racing. But certainly from Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1, they jump in it. They just can't. They're not compute. They can't compute it. They just can't do it. And I never, I did simulator work for some of the Formula 1 teams, but I never actually physically drove a Formula 1 car. So it would have been an unknown. I know I was fit enough at the end of 2009 we obviously got offered the deal in Virgin in 2010. I was certainly fit enough. I was beating the guys that went on to do well in Formula 1. So everything says that I probably would have been okay. But I wouldn't have known until I'd have got in it.
Well, that seems like a good place to call it a day, I think.
Call it a day.
Yeah.
Good.
I mean, we've been going for
really
2.5 hours. It's a nice long one.
A lot for you to edit.
There's a lot for me to edit, but it's been nice. It's nice.
Well, thanks for coming all the way to Jersey. It's been a pleasure to host you for once.
It was a slog getting all the equipment here, but we managed it in the end. But no, it's nice to have an informal chat and just discuss everything around motorsport. I think it's been nice.
Pleasure.
So thank you very much, James.
Anytime.
We've obviously got, if you can't tell, some of James's racing helmets.
These aren't
here.
competition giveaways, sadly, but
unfortunately
we'll have to come up with a competition giveaway of something for future podcasts. We'll come up with something.
They're amazingly complex in person.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for having us. And
anytime.
We should be getting this out, I think, prior to Christmas. Fingers crossed. It's going to take me a while to edit, but we should be able to get it out prior to Christmas. But for everybody that's listened to us this year, thank you very much. We will be doing it again next season, won't we?
Better do. But in the meantime, obviously, if people have got any questions, Instagram is probably the main thing. James Walker 83 on Instagram. Feel free to follow and fire any questions at me. And even if you're starting off in racing and it's literally a blank sheet of paper. I've spent many years helping young drivers get into the sport. And if nothing else, if you want to message and ask some questions, feel free.
Excellent. Yeah, we are also now on Instagram as of today. Who would have thought? Yeah, and so Brad, it's what, at F1 Sake on Instagram?
No.
So professional. Yeah, something. We'll
put a graphic up.
Yeah, there'll be some graphics somewhere on the screen. We'll list it. But obviously, the main channels for us is Twitter as well. So at F1 Sake, Brad at F1 Sake, Tom. You don't use your Twitter very often, but it is.
But thanks to you, I've now got it going again. So
all right,
I'm sure you'll figure out what it is. But you can get hold of me on Twitter. I'll always get the messages. Go for it.
Yeah. So make sure you get in the pot for us next season, because we'll try and bump up the production values yet again. See if we can get Brad a new microphone, maybe, and see if we can commit to that. But yeah, thank you very much for everybody that's listening. Have a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year. But until next season, thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.